So it seems you all really liked my last year-end retrospective, and I gotta admit, it was a lot of fun to do. So screw it!
Let's do it again!
Okay!
So logically, if I wanted to do each and every year of the game, we'd start back in 2002, right? But here's the thing, I don't want to do that. To be honest, the DM era of the TCG is so heavily covered by so many people, including myself, that there really isn't anything worth recapping. Especially since most of the things that happened over the course of its 3 years is roughly equivalent to a single year now. If you want a recap of everything that happened between the game's launch in 2002 and the rough end of the DM era in 2004, I'd heavily recommend Swag Kage or Ribbondale's video on the topic, as it's extremely in-depth, thorough with testimony from players of the time, and I truly don't think I could do any better. It's just an all-around amazing piece of documentative work for the game we all love. We're actually going to start ourselves in 2005, where the DM era was wrapping up and the GX era was just around the corner. So let's not waste any time and jump right in. Dragon's Roar and Zombie Madness. Release date, January 1st, 2005. Set type, Structure Decks. Major strategies, Dragons, Zombies. Impact, Staple reprints. The year of 2005 was started off with an action that would eventually become a staple of the game's release schedule, the first ever Structure Decks. Dragon's Roar and Zombie Madness would only bring a couple of new cards to the pool, specifically in Red Ice Darkness Dragon for Dragon's Roar and Vampire Genesis for Zombie Madness, neither of which were powerful enough in the current format of early 2005 to even be remotely worth running. However, these decks did bring something incredibly important to the longevity of the game, that being extremely accessible reprints of meta staples up until this point. Snatch Steal, Mystical Space Typhoon, Nobleman of Crossout, Premature Burial, Pot of Greed, Heavy Storm, Giant Trunade, Call of the Haunted, Torrential Tribute, and Compulsory Evacuation Device were all reprinted between these decks, making all of them far easier to obtain to the average player, as most had not seen a reprint outside of a specific reprint released back in late 2004, being Dark Beginning 1. This time period was also extremely important for the beginnings of the first big circuit of high-profile tournaments in Yu-Gi-Oh!, being the Shonen Jump Championship Series, otherwise known as the SJCs, which were technically started at the end of 2004 with SJC Anaheim, but truly came into its own at the start of 2005 with SJC Las Vegas, Columbus, and Orlando all happening within a few weeks of each other. SJC Vegas took place on February 8th of 2005, and though we do not have much information on the tournaments of this time period, we do have information on both the winners and the runners-up thanks to the old Konami blog entries. For Vegas, Wilson Luke would win the event with a Chaos Warrior brew, which we'll come to find was very standard at the time, as almost every deck would run the same package of meta-defining staples up until that point, comprising over half of practically any topping deck list. Second place was Ian Wingrove on Beast Down, which we do not have a complete deck list of, but we do have enough to get an idea of how aggressive his particular build was, aiming at winning battles early and often. SJC Columbus would take place a week later on February 13th, 2005, and would bring a lot of the same. Patrick Smith would take home the gold here with Chaos Warrior, while Gustavo Reyes would take second place with a Creator Chaos list that we, again, don't have the full list of, which is going to be a very common factor through a lot of these, as this is a very old set of data that we're working with. Lastly for this block, SJC Orlando took place 2 weeks later on February 27th of 2005, and once again, Chaos would win the day, with Andrew Fridella taking home the gold, and more importantly for these tournaments, the first place prize card. For all of the early SJCs, the first place finisher would receive a prize card that was exclusive for the time being to the SJC circuit, being Cyberstein, who could pay 5,000 life points to special summon a fusion from the fusion deck. This, at the time, was a highly sought after monster, but purely for the status of owning one thanks to its prize card status, as there was no fusion at the time worth paying over half of your life points to summon out when magical scientists could cheat out arguably the most relevant one, Thousand Eyes Restrict, for only 1,000. For Cyberstein to be relevant meta-wise, it would need a much better target, or targets, to summon. For now though, these tournaments would establish the meta of the time following the previous October ban list as one dominated by Chaos and the various powerful warrior monsters, and the next set did not look like it was going to be changing that fact. Flaming Eternity. Release date, March 1st, 2005. Set type, Core Set. Major Strategies, Nephthys, Beasts. Impact, Future Format Staples. Flaming Eternity is a set whose era placement is in a bit of a strange limbo state, as it's either at the tail end of the DM era, where it would be the only set in the entire era without Yugi on the packaging at all, or it's the beginning of the GX era, where none of the cards that are in it are recognizable to the GX anime, and even some cards are directly tied to the original anime. Regardless, Flaming Eternity did bring a couple of interesting new pieces to the metagame, but nothing so powerful as to upend the entire format. The cover card and main boss monster of the set was clearly Sacred Phoenix of Nephthys, a 2400 attack winged beast that would revive itself in the owner's next standby phase when it was destroyed by a card effect, nuking all spells and traps when it did. Nephthys would see experimentation with some players thanks to its ease of access through Hand of Nephthys, who could tribute itself and another monster to summon it from the deck. But its long-term staying power was put into question by the chaos-dominated metagame, as there was no shortage of ways to remove Nephthys without destroying it by card effect. The far more prevalent theme of the set were beast monsters, with cards like Behemoth, the king of all animals, Maji Geyer Panda, Beast Soul Swap, and probably the most iconic of all of the beasts in this set, Rescue Cat, who could send itself to grave from field to summon 2 level 3 or lower beasts from the deck, but destroyed them during the end phase. At the time, the errata to negate their effects was not present on this card, and Rescue Cat was recognized fairly quickly for its potential. The ability to summon out 2 of any of the low-leveled beasts from the deck held serious potential. However, the beast pool at the time was a good bit lacking, with its main application being summoning out Gyakugaier Panda and Milus Radiant for quick and easy damage. Rescue Cat's summon pool could only grow from here, which kept this particular card in a bit of a position of interest moving into the later eras of the game. Aside from these, there were also many powerful standalone cards that would shape different aspects of the format. Grand Marg the Rock Monarch was the latest monarch added to the pool, whose effect was a lot more specific than any of the other monarchs that came before it, destroying a set card, but could be used against spells, traps, and monsters. It wouldn't see as much play as Mobius due to only hitting 1 and specifically hitting sets, but it would pop up from time to time. Armed Samurai Benkai was another interesting piece that could enable its own deck focused around powerful equipped spells to enable OTKs, which would see some mild experimentation in its time but no long-term success. Golem Sentry would become yet another piece of good flip monster disruption, able to bounce a monster on flip summon and able to flip itself face down once per turn. Lightning Vortex was seen as a less powerful version of Raigeki, which was now banned, able to discard a card to destroy all face-up monsters from the opponent's field. Threatening Roar would see experimentation as it effectively let the user stall for a turn and was activatable in response to removal. Phoenix Wing Wind Blast was comparable to Raigeki Break, taking the same discard costs and having the same target requirements, but rather than destroying the target, it placed it on top of the owner's deck, which was useful in some cases where Raigeki Break was not. Good Goblin Housekeeping was an extremely odd card, as initially it's a card swap in hand, but when used with other copies of itself could turn into a +1 in total. Lastly, Deck Devastation Virus was a new, extremely targeted counter card, where you contribute a 2000 attack or higher dark monster to destroy all 1500 or lower attack monsters the opponent controlled, in their hand, and all that they draw for the next 3 turns, not being super popular on release, but seeing the occasional side deck play for certain strategies. Flaming Eternity did change some factors of the format with new generic staples overall, but nothing so groundbreaking as to upend the status quo, leading into the second ever reprint set printed in the TCG, and whether it would be as well received as the first was still up in the air. Dark Revelation Volume 1. Release date, March 19th, 2005. Set type, reprint set. Major strategies, the staples of late 2003. Impact, lowering the barrier to entry. Revelations 1 may have only been the second ever reprint set, but it essentially took what Beginnings 1 did and did it again with the later sets. Most cards originally printed between Pharaonic Guardian and Dark Crisis were reprinted here, meaning meta staples like Breaker the Magical Warrior, DD Warrior Lady, Magical Scientist, Tribe Infecting Virus, and various other cards from late 2003 were made more readily available. This would also be accompanied by a banlist update less than 2 weeks later to address the ever-centralizing meta that had been growing since the death of Chaos Control, and this particular banlist is very well known in the community for other reasons. Newly banned were Fiberjar, Magical Scientist, Makura the Destructor, Butterfly Dagger Elma, Change of Heart, Confiscation, Mirage of Nightmare, Painful Choice, and the Forceful Sentry, all being cards that either extremely promoted one-sided advantage generation, FTKs, or were generally just not desired to have in a healthy metagame. This is also noticeable as this was only the second batch of bans in the game's history, as the previous ban list had been the original one that removed CED and Yada from the game. Newly limited were DD Warrior Lady, Sacred Phoenix of Nephthys, Sangan, Delinquent Duo, Graceful Charity, Lightning Vortex, United We Stand, Deck Devastation Virus, and Mirror Force, some of which were banned on the previous list while others had formed a new meta landscape since the last ban list, specifically in DD Warrior Lady, who was a 2 to 3 of in practically every list since the last ban list. Newly semi-limited were Abyss Soldier, Dark Scorpion Chick the Yellow, Night Assailant, Vampire Lord, Emergency Provisions, Level Limit Area B, Upstart Goblin, Good Goblin Housekeeping, and Gravity Bind, limiting some of the cheekier interactions of some cards like Chick and Assailant, as well as the floodgate nature of cards like Level Limit and Gravity Bind. Lastly, Morphing Jar 2 was removed from the list, as its effect compared to the other jar cards was far less impactful, although this would lead to a resurgence in decks focused around the jars specifically. SJC Los Angeles would take place directly after this list took effect on April 2nd, 2005, and with the hits to Chaos Warrior now in effect, a new variant of Chaos would be on display here with first place Eric Wu's Zombie Chaos, which replaced the previous Warrior package with Pyramid Turtle and Vampire Lord. Keenson Yee's second place list would also heavily feature the same zombie core, although it would feature a Nephthys package rather than a Chaos core, showing the Chaos core was not absolutely required anymore, but it was still a powerful option nonetheless. SJC Houston would be just a few weeks later on April 30th, 2005, and first place would go to Ryan Hayakama on a particularly aggressive deck simply known as Beatdown, which looked to play all of the Chaos Warrior staples up until this point alongside a single copy of Berserk Gorilla to easily win early combats. Second would go to Therizak Punsombat on Warrior, but interestingly enough, both decks were running extremely similar lists, even though they are listed as completely different strategies. This would lead into the second set of structure decks released shortly after, and many looked to them to see if they would bring anything new to shake up this increasingly centralized metagame. Blaze of Destruction and Fury from the Deep. Release date, May 9th, 2005. Set type, Structure decks. Major strategies, Fire and Water. Impact, Monarchs for All. Blaze of Destruction and Fury from the Deep were very similar in nature to Dragon's Roar and Zombie Madness in that the one new card each that they brought would have no meta impact whatsoever, being Infernal Flame Emperor and Blaze of Destruction, and Ocean Dragon Lord Neo Daedalus and Fury from the Deep. However, like the previous structure decks, they provided easy access copies of staples up until this point, like Snatch Steal, Mystical Space Typhoon, Nobleman of Crossout, Premature Burial, Pot of Greed, Heavy Storm, Call of the Haunted, and Torrential Tribute. However, each of these decks brought one additional reprint that would actually make some waves due to making each affordable. Blaze of Destruction reprinted Thestalos the Firestorm Monarch, and Fury from the Deep reprinted Mobius the Frost Monarch, the two arguably best Monarch monsters at this point in their first easy access reprint ever, and they were included with each deck purchased. This was enough to get the two decks to sell, but still did nothing to shake up the metagame. However, a new era was on the horizon, and as June began, so did the official start of the next era of Yu-Gi-Oh! The Lost Millennium. Release date, June 1st, 2005. Set type, Core Set. Major strategies, Elemental Hero, Ancient Gear, Rocks. Impact, the start of something new. The Lost Millennium is where most people believe the GX era officially starts, which makes the most sense as one of its headlining features is the reintroduction of archetypes to Yu-Gi-Oh! While there had been some archetypes previously, such as Gravekeepers and Amazonas, this set is where the modern expression of archetype design begins, making a series of monsters that have a commonality between them to centralize their strategy and make specific support for just that subset of cards. The perfect example of this is the Elemental Hero series, which was also the main archetype used by Jaden Yuki, the main character of the GX anime, as a series of monsters whose primary gimmick is being able to fuse with each other to make various fusions for different situations. While their first wave was extremely limiting, bringing only the 4 main deck normal monsters, Flame Wingman, Thunder Giant, and a couple of support pieces like Hero Signal, Elemental Hero would grow from here to become a staple of the GX era sets. A similar situation could be applied to the other major archetype here in Ancient Gears, used by Dr. Crowler in the GX anime, a series of Earth Machine monsters that stun the ability to activate spells and traps when they attack, with Ancient Gear Soldier having that be its only effect, Beast, who negates the effects of monsters it destroys in battle, and the set headliner, Golem, who deals piercing damage on top of its stun effect. Ancient Gear would not break into the meta with this wave, but similar to Elemental Hero would continue to see support trickle out over the course of the era. The last major strategy that seemed to be present in this set was a focus on rock monsters, boosting the previous reflip strategy a bit with a couple of smaller monsters in Guardian Statue, who had a similar effect to Sentry Golem from earlier, Medusa Worm, who destroyed monsters instead of bouncing them, and a couple of new boss monsters in Hero Cross Sphinx, who prevented face-down monsters from being attacked, Cryo Sphinx, who hand ripped a card anytime a monster is bounced, and most importantly, Mega Rock Dragon, a monster who can be special summoned by banishing all rocks from the grave and gain 700 attack and defense for each. Some of the rocks here like Medusa, Guardian, and Mega Rock would go on to see experimentation alongside other flip and reset monsters, but in terms of major success these would not be meta-defining threats. As for standalone cards of interest, DD Survivor returned to the field anytime it's banished from the field, which could be seen as a counter to the current banishing warrior threats. Des Wombat completely walled off effect damage, seeing side deck play for that effect. King of the Skull Servants gained 1000 attack for each of its self or Skull Servant in your graveyard, spawning a niche deck off of it, and Brain Control, which could pay 800 life points to steal an opponent's face-up monster for the turn, seemingly designed as a more balanced change of heart. All of these new introductions would be legal for the summer SJC events, starting with SJC New Jersey on June 11th of 2005. First and second place respectively would be claimed by previous SJC winners Ryan Hayakawa and Wilson Luke, being on Chaos Warriors and a Chaos Flip toolbox respectively. Both players would be on a combo that would become far more recognizable for this particular format over the next few tournaments, that being Metamorphosis alongside a quick play spell known as Scapegoat, which summons 0 attack and defense tokens to chump block hits for you. By using Metamorphosis on a sheep token, you could summon out Thousand Eyes Restrict from the fusion deck without losing it at the end of the turn like with Magical Scientist, which quickly became one of the most powerful things you could be doing in the format. This flip toolbox over the next few months would take on a new name as Goat Control, and from this, the term for this particular point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, known as Goat format, would be coined, standing for both Scapegoat, which had become a staple of the format, and Greatest of All Time, as many do refer to this period as one of the best Yu-Gi-Oh formats to ever exist. SJC Charlotte would be held just 2 weeks later on June 25th, 2005, and it would run with the meta shifts from New Jersey prior, with first place being Anthony Alvarado on Chaos, playing the newly popularized Metamorphosis with Scapegoat for access to Thousand Eyes Restrict. Jay Kim would take second place here with an interesting list compared to the meta, Zombie. His list would include no Chaos monsters, and would instead be focused on the interaction of Pyramid Turtle with Vampire Lord to control the game. Book of Life here would also majorly shine thanks to its ability to banish pieces of the opponent's Chaos core from the game, similarly to how Kaiku was used previously. SJC Seattle would take place soon after on July 9th, 2005, and once again Chaos would be back on top, taking first and second place piloted by Osman Ortiz and Robert Leem respectively. Osman's unique card for his build was Guardian KS, who couldn't be summoned normally, but could be set, and once she's faced up, she can't be targeted for attacks and is unaffected by spells, essentially becoming a nearly unbeatable monster in the current format. Goat Control had solidified itself as a meta mainstay with these results, and more people had gravitated towards the Metamorphosis and Scapegoat package for their decks, which would only be bolstered by the reprint set that soon followed. Dark Beginning Volume 2. Release date, July 27th, 2005. Set type, reprint set. Major strategies, various pieces from 2002 to 2003. Impact, the calm before the storm. With Dark Beginning 2, players would once again be given a chance to grab meta staples, this time in the forms of Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, Bazoo the Soul Eater, Blade Knight, Mirror Force, Graceful Charity, and the first ever easy access prints of Cyberstein, the SJC prize card, and Morphing Jar, whose only printings until now were in tournament packs. While this made the format easier to get into, this is a bit of a send-off for the DM era in general, as less than a month later, the next major core set would release, and with it would be the new pinnacle of card design and what a card needed to be playable. Cybernetic Revolution. Release date, August 17th, 2005. Set type, core set. Major strategies, Cyber, Vehicroid, Hero. Impact, the future of card design. It's no exaggeration to say that Cybernetic Revolution truly did revolutionize the game as a whole, essentially recontextualizing what a card had to be in order to be considered good moving forward. This was entirely thanks to Cyber Dragon, a level 5 2100 attack monster that could be special summoned if you controlled no monsters while your opponent did, which would take some time but would slowly become a staple in literally every deck in the format. Cyber Dragon being such a value card for almost no investment changed the threshold for powerful monsters immediately, as it could contest literally any no tribute monster in the format, could be used as tribute fodder for a more powerful threat like Jinzo or Mobius, and to top it all off was a light monster for the Chaos Core to abuse. Arguably the best light target for the core ever printed, since DD Warrior Lady usually didn't stay in the graveyard. On top of this, Cyber Dragon brought with it two fusions in Cyber Twin and Cyber End Dragon, the former being a fusion of two Cyber Dragons that could attack twice in a turn, and the latter being a fusion of 3 with piercing damage. These two would recontextualize the power of Cyberstein, making the former prize card into an absolute powerhouse threat in the format, as you could now trade 5,000 life points for a monster that could end the game on the spot. However, this wasn't really known at first. Cyberstein would go on to be a completely unknown card in the metagame, even though all the pieces to make it extremely powerful were just sitting there. Beyond these threats, a lot of minor additions to the card pool would also be included here, such as Cyrus's Vehicroids, which had almost no connective tissue between them and did nothing overall outside of Drillroid, who destroyed any defense position monster it attacked, which saw play in various decks as a new staple piece. Hero would receive Bubbleman, who could special summon itself from hand if it was the last card there, and Miracle Fusion, the first ever spell that let you fusion summon using materials in the graveyard. This release would sort of establish the main theme with hero archetypes for a long period of time. They were the testing ground for new fusion themes and concepts before moving them out to more general strategies. A perfect example of this was Miracle Fusion, which was also released alongside Dragon's Mirror, which had the same effect except it was for Dragon Fusion monsters. These two would be the start of various archetypes and strategies getting similar fusion spells as time went on, though would also both have their own meta implications later, but for very different reasons. SJC Indianapolis would take place 3 days later on August 20th, 2005, and the full gravity of these releases would take quite a while to really impact the meta, as for the time being most players were opting to just continue playing decks as they were previously. First and second place would be taken by Go Control variants piloted by Nareg Tarosian and Michael Fukuyama respectively, neither of whom were playing the new cards from Cybernetic Revolution. In retrospect, Cyber Dragon and Cyberstein were absolutely ready to take over the meta, they would just need to be discovered first. With yet another SJC in the books, most players looked forward to the next big release, even if it was mostly reprints, as there were a few cards worth opening for. Collectible Tins 2005. Release date, September 1st, 2005. Set type, Yearly Tins. Major strategies, the last packs of the DM era. Impact, a single relevant promo. The tins of yesteryear were a good bit different than how the yearly tin releases work now. Back then, rather than a mega pack including the best parts of the previous year's sets, the tins would simply include one of each pack from the block that they're reprinting. However, the tins back then also each had a promo that was completely new, resulting in 6 new cards being released, although a few of them were just simply new alternate art variants like Dark Magician Girl. The only new promo that had any impact here was Xarian Universe, an 1800 dark monster that could drop its attack by 400 for the turn to deal piercing damage, which became an occasional slot in for Chaos variants looking for a counter to Scapegoat. This was clearly on display with SJC Boston taking place just over a week later on September 10th of 2005, where both first and second place finishes would be on Chaos with Xarian Universe included, being Brian Long and Brian Coronel respectively. Long was also on a card that would become extremely popular for dealing with Scapegoat, being a Jura Priest, a spirit monster that could attack each monster the opponent controlled once each, being useful for clearing out a board of sheep tokens in a single sweep. Similarly, Air Knight Parshath had also started to pick up popularity for a similar reason to Xarian Universe, as the ability to deal piercing damage through the tokens was becoming increasingly ideal to players. Coronel's list, however, was one of the first major successes to include Cyber Dragon in their list, which would only become more and more common as the format evolved, partially sped up by the next ban list update. The ban list was updated on October 1st of 2005, and with this update came the arguable end of the Chaos era of the game. Blackluster Soldier, Sinister Serpent, Tribe Infecting Virus, Delinquent Duo, Graceful Charity, Pot of Greed, Mirror Force, and Ring of Destruction were all now banned in one fell swoop, removing some of the most powerful cards of the format from the game for an extremely long period of time, some even remaining on the ban list from this hit to this day. Newly limited were Magician of Faith, Night Assailant, Thousand Eyes Restrict, Tsukiyomi, Book of Moon, Book of Taiyu, Confiscation, Dark Hole, Limiter Removal, Metamorphosis, Nobleman of Crossout, Scapegoat, and Exchange of the Spirit. Most of these hits targeted at the theme of flip control that had become pervasive in the current format, along with the power of the Goat Control core. Lastly, Chick the Yellow, Marauding Captain, and Vampire Lord were all released from this list, as their semi-limited status didn't really affect their power levels all too much. SJC Atlanta would be the first real display of these changes on October 8th of 2005, just a week after the changes went into effect. The first place finish from John Jensen, being Chaos, seemed a little odd at first with all the hits that just took place, but a good portion of the deck was more so focused on general control pieces like the various good warrior pieces, like DD Assailant, Warrior Lady, Exiled Force, and Mystic Swordsman level 2. In addition to this, while BLS was now banned, Chaos Sorcerer was still legal, giving a less powerful option to use for Chaos pushes. Daniel Fitzgerald would take second place with Phoenix Burn, mostly being the same deck just with more burn options thanks to Wave Motion Cannon. Both of these players were on a single copy of Cyber Dragon, and this was a bit of a contentious point as it was growing in the player base that 2 to 3 copies of the powerhouse may actually be ideal moving forward, though discussion of this was mostly on the old Pojo forums rather than being reflected in actual results. With the new format having a few weeks to steep, the next wave of reprints would be given to the masses, making the newly opened format that much more accessible. Dark Revelation Volume 2. Release date, October 20th, 2005. Set type, reprint set. Major strategies, the Chaos Bosses. Impact, weren't these cards just banned? Dark Revelation Volume 2 was a bit of a head-scratcher of a set, as its main 2 draws, being Blackluster Soldier and Chaos Emperor Dragon reprints, were already banned, making the main chase cards of the set completely unusable in the current metagame. That wasn't to say that there was nothing from this set, far from it. With reprints of popular meta cards like Berserk Gorilla, Freed the Brave Warrior, Chaos Sorcerer, D-Mock, Zaborg, and Night Assailant, there were cards to get here, just not nearly as much for the meta as the previous reprint sets. This one unfortunately came out at the exact wrong time to be well received, and it didn't even have a lot of time in the market as the new product, as just over a week later the next structure deck would be released. Warriors Triumph. Release date, October 28th, 2005. Set type, structure deck. Major strategies, warrior. Impact, reprinting the meta kings and queens. Similarly to other structure decks of the era, the new card of Warriors Triumph, being Guilford the Legend, did practically nothing to the metagame at large, but it did provide some of the most significant reprints we have received thus far. Exiled Force, DD Warrior Lady, Mystic Swordsman level 2, Ninja Grandmaster Sasuke, Snatch Steal, Mystical Space Typhoon, Giant Trunade, Heavy Storm, Rhoda, Lightning Vortex, and Call of the Haunted were all reprinted here, with some of these getting their first ever non-foil reprint, making them far more accessible to newer players. This release was followed up by SJC Chicago in the same weekend on October 29, 2005, being the first SJC without Cyberstein as the prize card, being replaced by Des Volstgoth for the next year of play. Dale Bolito would take first place with yet another Chaos Brew, but very much more notably playing 2 Cyber Dragons, finally punctuating the power of the recent monster. Carlos Santiago's second place deck would similarly be on 2 of Cyber Dragon, notably dropping the Chaos monsters in their entirety to place more focus on the new up-and-coming threat in the meta, Spirit Reaper. With so many of the big removal pieces of the format now either limited or banned, Reaper was growing in popularity as an extremely difficult monster to out in the moment. Santiago's inclusion of 3 in his deck would speak to its value as a battle blocker and game staller, and this would only grow with future events. With Cyber Dragon and Spirit Reaper's growing popularity, many looked to the next major core set to bring a couple more pieces to really shake up the meta after the last ban list. Elemental Energy. Release date, November 16, 2005. Set type, Core Set. Major strategies, Chemical, Dark World. Impact, diversifying the staple pool. Elemental Energy, while not bringing anything nearly as powerful as Cyber Dragon, was still a solid set for its era. Continuing the theme of bringing in decks used in the GX anime, Bastion's chemical monsters would be released here, most notably including Hydrogeddon, who summons another copy of itself from deck when it destroys a monster in battle. This was an extremely cheap and effective way to swarm your board at the time when board swarming was more limited than it had been previously, and Hydrogeddon's 1600 attack body was actually a decent amount of bulk to trigger its effect, seeing play from time to time in decks that could enable it. Dark World was probably one of the most notable releases here, a series of monsters that gain powerful effects if discarded by card effect, and even more so if discarded by the opponents, including Beige, who special summons itself, Brow, who draws a card, or 2 if discarded by the opponent, and Silva, who special summons itself and makes the opponent shuffle back 2 cards from hand if discarded by the opponent. However, these effects were rather difficult to trigger at first due to most of the good discard related spells, like Graceful Charity, now being banned, and with hand ripping effects at an all-time low, the opponent discarding your cards was even less likely. However, there was a niche for these cards, which allowed them to mostly see side deck tech play against specific strategies, like Empty Jar, but those were exceedingly rare at the time. Arguably the best card released here was Pot of Avarice, which let you shuffle back 5 monsters from grave to draw 2 cards, being essentially a pot of greed that required some setup. This card was decently popular in its time, though a little situational, but would grow far more popular as the game continues to speed up, making grave recycling a bit more powerful than initially thought. A second SJC would take place in Los Angeles 3 days later on November 19, 2005, and with it, the power of both Cyber Dragon and Spirit Reaper were rapidly taking over the meta. First place was taken by Paul Levitin with a Bazoo return strategy, notably playing a copy of DD Survivor in the main deck, as it was a powerful counter to the various DD assailants and warrior ladies running around the event. Angel Flores would take second with Warrior Beatdown, notably also playing 2 Cyber Dragon and 2 Spirit Reaper, as well as playing the 1 DD Survivor. It was becoming more and more important for decks at the time to have some way to out the Spirit Reaper on the board without committing any removal options, which led to the increasing popularity of Drillroid and Mystic Swordsman level 2, both of which saw play in the first and second place lists respectively. SJC San Francisco would take place just under a month later on December 10, 2005, being the final SJC of the year, and it would solidify the new meta trends. Philly Luna would take first place with a deck mostly comprised of the new staples we've mentioned in a pseudo-control strategy, having upped their count of Cyber Dragon to the maximum 3 copies. Michael Bueno would take second with a Chaos build, very interestingly playing 2 Chaos Sorcerers and, most notably, 3 Dekoichi, who provided Bueno with a dark name in the grave for Sorcerer, as well as an additional draw power on flip. This would round out the 2005 competitive year, and would set the stage for the year to follow. Cyber Dragon and Spirit Reaper had fully risen as the new kings of the meta, with Cyberstein present and just waiting to be discovered. Chaos had also fallen from its once high pedestal, and from its ashes more and more generalized decks have emerged. As the GX era will progress, more packs may bring fewer changes in themselves, but player innovation will continue to shape just how far the game itself can be pushed. Spellcaster's Judgment. Release date, January 18th, 2006. Set type, Structure Deck. Major strategies, Spellcasters. Impact, Solidifying Trends. Spellcaster's Judgment was the first of many sets in this particular year that brought absolutely no changes to the metagame as a whole, as its only new additions, Dark Eradicator Warlock and Mystical Beast Cerberus, were nothing but gimmicky win condition cards that took way more setup to pull off than they're worth. Far more important than these though were the reprints, as in addition to the standard staple reprints of MST, Knock, Premat, Storm, and Vortex, the deck also included many of the staple monsters of the time that happened to all be spellcasters, being Magician of Faith, Breaker the Magical Warrior, Tsukiyomi, Chaos Sorcerer, and even a card that would soon pick up steam in the meta, Apprentice Magician. Spellcasters for a while had been some of the most powerful pieces in the meta, but this structure deck would also help solidify the growing trend of a certain deck into the meta that we'll cover soon. With that said, this wasn't the only set to bring nothing new to the table, as a brand new type of set was about to release that would provide similar results. Duelist Packs Jaden, Yuki, and Chazz Princeton. Release date February 8th, 2006. Set type, Duelist Pack. Major strategies, Elemental Hero, Armed Dragon, Ojama, V to Z. Impact, new set type, same disappointments. Duelist Packs Jaden and Chazz were the first ever of the Duelist Pack series, and they almost killed the entire concept on arrival. All of the strategies being promoted within them were completely irrelevant, even with new cards added, with Elemental Hero Steam Healer, Burst Return, Bubble Blaster, Bubble Illusion, and Clay Charge for Jaden, and Armed Dragon level 10, Magical Mallet, Inferno Reckless Summon, Ring of Defense, and the Grave of Enkindling for Chazz. Among the 10 cards, only 2 would ever see experimentation ever, being Magical Mallet as a way to solve FTK hands, which was still subpar, and Inferno Reckless Summon being an experimental piece for jank combo decks in later eras. While these releases were impactful for establishing the Duelist Packs as a whole, their relevance doesn't extend far beyond that, which would only be accented by the next core set released 2 weeks later. Shadow of Infinity. Release date February 19th, 2006. Set type, Core Set. Major strategies, Sacred Beasts, Armageddon, Insects. Impact, 1 staple piece for Monarchs. Shadow of Infinity, being the first core set of 2006, holds a bit of stigmatism behind it, as a major theme behind sets of 2006 was that in their time, they did absolutely nothing to change the meta landscape as a whole. While this was mostly true, almost every set would have at least one card that held significance for the current state of the meta, which in Shadow of Infinity's case was undoubtedly Treeborn Frog, a monster that could revive itself in your standby phase as long as you controlled no spells or traps, at this point in time missing the once per turn on its effect. What that meant is that as long as you were still in the standby phase, Treeborn Frog could be revived an infinite amount of times, meaning if you had some effect to tribute him off, such as enemy controller, you could revive him again as long as you were still in the standby phase. While this particular interaction of its effects was not taken full advantage of at this time, Treeborn would sneak its way into many deck lists of the year due to its interactions with the Monarchs released in 2005, as it provided tribute fodder every turn for your Monarchs as long as you had no spell or traps coming into your turn. The other relevant piece of the meta in the time was Sandmoth, which would see play directly following Shadow of Infinity's release in multiple topping lists of the next few SJCs, being seen as a counter to specifically Mystic Swordsman level 2, who would destroy it before flipping it face up, allowing it to revive as a 2000 attack monster. Beyond this, there were other pieces in the set of note, but none would be relevant to the metagame at this point in time. The Sacred Beasts were the cover strategy of the set, and they flopped incredibly hard, requiring decks revolving around fiends, continuous spells, or continuous traps to be viable, none of which were particularly good at this stage. Insects received a boost here with cards like Gokapon, who searched an insect on battle destruction, Chainsaw Insect, the largest no tribute body in the game at 2400 with the cost of letting your opponent draw if it battles, and the most relevant to the long term, Doomdozer, who could be special summoned by banishing 2 insects in grave and milled the opponent by 1 when it dealt battle damage. Most of these would be irrelevant out the gate, however Doomdozer would see pop-up success in multiple eras of the game due to new synergies coming to light. Lastly, the End of the World series were ritual monsters able to be summoned with a titular ritual spell, being Ruin, Queen of the Oblivion, and Demise, King of Armageddon. Ruin could attack again if it destroyed something in battle, while Demise could pay 2,000 life points to nuke the board other than himself. It should be fairly clear that these two effects are not at all equal, and that Demise was the far stronger of the two, being one of the first relevant ritual payoffs ever. But the issue stood that rituals were still too clunky to make work effectively, and until the process was streamlined a little, Demise would be irrelevant. These changes were in effect as we entered into the SJC season, beginning with SJC Durham on February 25th, 2006. The meta had pushed into being control focused, with Spirit Reaper being at the center of it all. As a note, while these are all technically different decks, a majority of them had a similar 20 to 30 card core that was common among all of them, leading to some difficulty delineating between themes. SJC Durham was won by Christopher Flores on Beatdown Control Hybrid, being extremely notable here for including widespread Ruin in his list in addition to the 3 copies of Sakuretsu armor. SJC Orlando would soon follow on March 18, 2006, which saw a significant shift towards the use of Monarch-focused control strategies with the popularity of Treeborn Frog. Michael Lux would win the event on a Warrior Monarch hybrid control deck, synergizing an opponent's hesitation of attacking into the DD Banishers, with the tribute summon power of Mobius to clear out opposing back row. These results would solidify Monarch as a force in the current meta, leading into the new baseline for the year with a yearly starter deck update. Starter Deck 2006. Release date, March 23rd, 2006. Set type, Starter Deck. Major strategies, Elemental Hero. Impact, setting a baseline. The 2006 starter deck was exactly what it says on the box, a deck for starting the game with, not a big revelation on how to play the game. It was also a really bad way to introduce new players, as the only relevant meta cards it contained were Magician of Faith, Skellingull, Premat, Storm, BrainCon, Saku, and Compulse, all of which could already be found fairly easily at this stage. SJC Long Beach would take place that weekend on March 25th, 2006, and from it we'd see Monarch continue to grow its new foothold in the meta. Stephen Adair would win the event with Chaos Monarch, taking the flip monsters and light and dark core of the Chaos deck and melding it with Zaborg the Thunder Monarch, who helped in providing a light target for your Chaos sorcerers. Shortly after Long Beach, the ban list was updated on April 1st, 2006, seeing a sudden shift in certain staple pieces. Banned were Cyberjar, Dark Hole, Exchange of Spirit, Last Turn, and Time Seal, with the only relevant meta hit here being Dark Hole. Most of these hits were aimed at janky FTK decks in the meta that rarely showed up in top cuts, but still needed to be handled. Limited were DD Assailant, who had become staples similar to Warrior Lady before it, Mask of Darkness, which had been growing in popularity for Chaos decks, Treeborn Frog, to hamper the Monarchs before they got out of hand, Graceful Charity, returning to the meta, Last Will, which was about to cause some issues with a certain Stein, Level Limit Area B, limiting the only big floodgate of the time, Pot of Avarice, as the spell had become much more popular recently, Drop Off, to prevent Yada Lock style strategies, and Mirror Force, bringing back the popular Battle Trap. Semi-limited were Magician of Faith, giving a copy back, Apprentice Magician, as the card enabled Faith and was expected to see use alongside it, and Reflect Bounder, Nobleman of Crossout, and Deck Devastation Virus to ease their previous hits. Lastly, released from this list were Abyss Soldier, as water decks weren't relevant anymore, and Taiyu, as the cards it enabled were now mostly banned. SJC Baltimore would be the first SJC of the new format on April 8, 2006, and off the changes, many would default back to basic control strategies, with Monarch still having some good representation with only one Treeborn Frog. However, the breakout of this particular event was Shane Scurry's Chaos Return, which would win the event. This deck took the previously popular Chaos strategy with Chaos Sorcerer and added one card that completely changed the deck's endgame, Return from the Different Dimension. Return made it to where anything you banish over the course of the game is fuel in your tank to end the game with a burst of sudden damage, turning the Flailing Chaos strategy into the new go-to deck of the format. This was on full display at SJC Columbus, where Chaos Return would not only take over half of the top 8 representation, but also the prize card would once again switch. Das Volstgaff was retired and Shrink was introduced as the new prize card moving forward. Iman Gainan would win the event with Chaos Return, notably maxing out his copies of Chaos Sorcerer and Return, which was seen as a bit of overkill at the time, but made sense for seeing your payoffs as often as possible. The new meta king had been established, and with it, many looked to the next couple of sets to immediately dethrone it. Invincible Fortress. Release date, May 15th, 2006. Set type, Structure Deck. Major strategies, Rock. Impact, the standard Structure Deck reprints. At this point, we've seen the same story repeatedly for Structure Decks in the era that the next bit shouldn't be a shock. None of the new cards from Invincible Fortress would change anything about the meta, being Great Spirit and Exod Master of the Guard. For reprints, Sandmoth, Giant Rat, MST, Premat, BrainCon, Compulse, and Ultimate Offering were reprinted here, with most of these already having accessible reprints or original printings at this point. Invincible Fortress literally changed nothing in the game as a whole, as it would leave that impact for the core set that followed 2 days later. Enemy of Justice. Release date, May 17th, 2006. Set type, Core Set. Major strategies, Destiny Hero, Banishers. Impact, The Long Game. Enemy of Justice on release, similar to most 2006 sets, wouldn't change much in terms of immediate impact, but this set would have a few impactful cards that would come to light over time. The main attraction of this set was the introduction of the Destiny Hero archetype, meant to be a rival to the Elemental Heroes and, just like them, were completely unplayable in a competitive sense on initial release. The only one worth mentioning here was Diamond Dude, who stood out from the remainder of the archetype as actually decent, able to potentially mill a normal spell and use its effect the following turn, which would see eventual play with the release of other cards. Cyber Phoenix was another interesting piece, able to negate spells and traps that target machines, and drew a card when destroyed in battle, eventually seeing play. Elemental Hero would receive the Hero Flash pieces, of which only one was playable, but E-Emergency Call was extremely useful to the archetype, being essentially Rhoda for the archetype, which was useful with Rhoda's current banlist status, although Elemental Hero was not at all playable at this stage. Icarus Attack would let you tribute off a Wing Beast to pop 2, which was recognizably strong, but there were no Wing Beast decks in the format to leverage it. Lastly, Banishing got a major boost of support here with the release of Banisher of the Radiance, Dimensional Fissure, and Macrocosmos, all of which banish cards sent to the grave while face up on the field, with Fissure specifically only affecting monsters while Banisher and Macro affected all cards. These three would be integral to various strategies over the course of the game's history, with Macrocosmos specifically coining the community term of macro effects, applying to anything that banishes cards sent to the graveyard, although their short-term success was minimal. SJC's Chicago would take place 3 days later on May 20th, 2006, and it solidified the dominance that was Chaos Return in the format, taking a staggering 7 of the 8 top positions. Brent Yetter would win the event with the aforementioned Chaos Return, being interesting in his approach with the inclusion of Zaborg and Genzo, not only for the Monarch-style game plan with Treeborn Frog, but also as bomb drops when brought back with Return, as they could be the light and dark for a Chaos Sorcerer summon. The next event wouldn't be for almost a month, being SJC Atlanta on June 17, 2006, and the results would still show a dominance of Chaos Return in the format, with Sean Long taking the event with an almost hybrid of Chaos Return with Monarch, seeing more Zaborg added in since it did provide the light target needed for Chaos Sorcerer. A point of note, however, from this event was the single top 8 spot for Cyberstein OTK, piloted by Zach Johnson, as the strategy having a top performance now meant it would be on more players' radars moving forward, especially with the power it could output very suddenly. A week later at SJC Denver on June 24, 2006, Chaos Return would come back with a vengeance to claim the entire top 8, cementing it as the deck to beat in the format. Amon Ganon would once again win using Chaos Return, going much heavier on the Return package than many of his opponents, opting for 3 Sorcerer and 2 Return, also interestingly enough playing Mobius in place of Genzo, marking his second SJC win in 2006. It was safe to say at this point that Chaos Return was unquestionably the best deck in the format of the time, and it was seeming to stay that way leading up to the World Championships in a little over a month, unless something changed quickly. Lord of the Storm. Release date, July 12, 2006. Set type, Structure Deck. Major strategies, Winged Beasts. Impact, another staple grab. Lord of the Storm, and stop me if you've heard this one before, brought only a couple of new cards, being Samorg, Bird of Divinity, and Sonic Shooter, neither of which would change anything in the meta. For the reprints this time, Card Destruction, MST, Knock, Storm, Vortex, and Saku were all reprinted here, with Card Destruction being notable as it was the first time the card was reprinted outside of the two Yugi starter decks. SJC Arlington took place just 3 days later on July 15, 2006, and with it, we finally saw a deck rise up to be able to counter Chaos Return, being Chaos Creature Swap, a deck that essentially does the same thing, but took advantage of recruiters like Mystic Tomato and Return's tendency to leave larger threats on board while building up their final pushes to steal away big threats while growing their own board presence. While the event would be won by Chaos Return, piloted by James Naughton, second place would be taken by this variant of Chaos, piloted by Jake McNeely, who also happened to be playing a single copy of Cyberstein for the surprise OTK factor. This trend would fully take hold by SJC Philadelphia a week later on July 22, 2006, where Chaos Creature Swap would overtake Chaos Return for top 8 representation, even taking the event piloted by Kyle Duncan, who had moved to include even more Chaos recruiters like Shining Angel to make his trades even more live. Another sighting happened here for Cyberstein OTK, making a top 8 appearance yet again, but it was about to get far more noticeable. While an SJC top was sure to turn some heads towards a rogue deck at the time, with communication not being as strong as it is today, it would take a while for most deck trends to catch on. What could jumpstart that, however, was a top at the World Championships, held in Akihabara, Japan on August 6, 2006. While we do not know any of the deck lists outside of the top 3, we do know that Chaos had an extremely potent showing in the tournament, as many expected. Dario Longo of Italy would reign victorious here playing Chaos Monarchs, notably using no copies of Return from the Different Dimension. Just as notably was his inclusion of Cyberstein and Last Will in the main deck, which many more would take note of from these results, as standardly moving forward, Cyberstein was an auto-include in every deck, no matter the strategy. With the following SJC in Indianapolis on August 12, 2006, Chaos Return would fall mostly out of favor, seeing the takeover of Chaos Creature Swap as the preferred deck of the format, especially with the rising popularity of Apprentice Magician, who could give access to Magician of Faith or Old Vindictive Magician on Destruction, still occasionally including Return in the deck, but not always requiring it now. John Jensen would win the event with this deck, marking his second SJC victory, and cementing the Cyberstein inclusion in decks moving forward. With the meta becoming increasingly solved and players rapidly approaching an event horizon of sorts with Cyberstein, most turned to the next core set to maybe introduce something new that would break it up even slightly. Power of the Duelist. Release date, August 16, 2006. Set type, core set. Major strategies, Neos, Alien, Machine. Impact, further niche pieces, no meta staples. Power of the Duelist, while many hoped it would break the streak of dud releases, only continued the trend further, bringing nothing impactful to the meta of the time, but still included a couple of pieces that would eventually bring impact in later formats and eras. Starting with the set's headliner, Elemental Hero Neos and his Neospatians would revitalize the old concept of contact fusion, which would shuffle the fusion materials from field to deck to summon out the fusion monster rather than using polymerization. However, the Neos fusions were all subpar in power level and had the crippling condition of returning to the extra deck at the end of the turn, marking the concept as dead on arrival. Destiny heroes received new support here, most notably in Dasher and Fearmonger, both of which would be impactful to the strategy later in the era, but for now did very little. The Alien archetype would also be introduced here, a series of monsters focused around placing A counters, which dropped the monster's attack and defense by 300 for each when battling an alien monster, including Alien Grey, who placed counters on flip and drew a card when destroyed after being flipped, Warrior, who placed 2 counters on whatever destroys it in battle, and the Trap Brainwashing Beam, which acted like Snatch Steal, taking an opponent's monsters with A counters and removing 1 counter during each end phase, returning the monster when it ran out of A counters or when the card was destroyed. Aliens would be experimented with, but for the time being came up short in the metagame in terms of power level. Mausoleum of the Emperor was a new field spell that allowed players to tribute summon using 1,000 life points as the tribute cost, enabling larger tribute monsters easy access. Lastly, and probably most impactful long term, fusion cards received a couple of major pieces of support here. The first was Overload Fusion and Cybernetic Overdragon, seen as an end boss for machine strategies that could banish any number of machines, including a Cyberdragon, from grave to bring out a Hail Mary boss monster, able to attack up to the number of materials used and gain attack for each, which wasn't impactful initially, but was heavily enabled by the other card, Future Fusion. On activation, Future Fusion revealed a fusion and sent its materials from deck to grave, summoning that monster 2 turns later. While summoning Cybernetic this way was not smart, as it would nuke the Future Fusion on summon and render the summon pointless, it could still be used to load the grave with as many machines as possible to enable Overload Fusion that turn to end the game. With this combo, Cybernetic OTK would be created and pop up from time to time into the meta, mostly rising into popularity in 2007 once the current meta had passed. SJC Hamilton would take place over a week later on August 26, 2006, and with it would come the end of an era. Chaos Creature Swap, now being referred to as Chaos Recruiter due to the pivot away from Return and more focus being placed on the Recruiter aspect of the deck, once again showed its dominance, taking 4 of the top 8 spots, but would not win the day overall. That honor would be taken by Corey Fabish on Cyberstein OTK, being the first SJC victory for the strategy using cards like Nimble Momonga for life point management, and ending the game with either Cyber Twin or End Dragon boosted by limiter removal or Megamorph. This would also mark the official end of Chaos in the format for the time being, as the new ban list would take effect under a week later on September 1st, 2006. Newly banned were Chaos Sorcerer due to its role in the dominance of Chaos strategies, Thousand Eyes Restrict to prevent the cheesing of its effect with fusion cheat-outs, Tsukiyomi to prevent the reusage of flip effects and the general control it provided, and Snatch Steal, one of the holdout power spells of 2002. Newly limited, or Magician of Faith, being put back following its role in Chaos Recruiter's popularity, Spirit Reaper, as it had been staple for almost every deck in the format, Future Fusion, to preemptively hit the Cybernetic OTK before it caught on, Knock due to its staple status, Gravity Bind due to its floodgate nature, Ring of Destruction, bringing it back from Forbidden, and Ultimate Offering to prevent interactions with soon-to-be-released cards that would be affected by unlimited normal summons. Newly semi'd were Exiled Force, as Warrior's presence in the meta had decreased substantially, Giant Trunade, as the back row stun was a little too accessible with all the removals hit, Reckless Greed to prevent stacking multiples, and Wall of Revealing Light due to its interactions with low life point cards like Self-Destruct Button. Lastly, released were Reflect Bounder, Emergency Provisions, Lightning Vortex, and Drop Off, as all of them had since passed the need for restrictions. An extremely important point here was not what was hit, but rather what wasn't. One of the most consistent non-tier 1 decks in the meta was Cyberstein OTK, and it wasn't touched at all on this list, which would come to be a detrimental error on the side of the balance team, as Cyberstein's power was now out in the open and just waiting to be broken even further in a newly hampered metagame. Collectible Tins 2006. Release dates September 11th and November 3rd, 2006. Set type Yearly Tins. Major strategies Cyberdragon, Hero, The Sacred Beasts. Impact reprinting the one true staple. The Collectible Tins were moving away from their unique promos this year, as they would instead release reprints of previous chase cards from the last year's sets, with Wave 1 including Cyberdragon, Neos, and Raviel, and Wave 2 including Shining Flare Wingman, Haman, and Uriah. While 5-6 of these were not impactful at all to the meta, Cyberdragon receiving an easy access reprint was extremely important, as the card was consistently played at 3 in practically every deck of the format, so making it more accessible for the average budget player was greatly appreciated. The first SJC of the newly balanced format took place in Boston on September 16, 2006, painting a clear picture of the new meta. Monarch control would be the dominating force here, with Warrior Toolbox close behind, seeing the event taken by Bobby Chambers on Monarch, playing 3 Zaborg alongside a small recruiter package. This was followed by SJC Austin 3 weeks later on October 7, 2006. 3 Warrior control, 2 Monarch control, 1 Cyberstein OTK, 1 Hydrogeddon beatdown, and 1 Gear-Free control using Smoke Grenade of the Thief would fill out the top 8, with Tristan Patillo taking home first place with Monarch, notably using 3 Thessalos and the Apprentice Magician package. With these results, the meta was still up in the air between Monarch, Warrior, and Cyberstein, all 3 seeing success at both SJCs, and realistically that wasn't going to change with the next structure deck releasing 2 weeks later. Dinosaur's Rage. Release date, October 20th, 2006. Set type, Structure Deck. Major strategies, Dinosaur. Impact, pushing the impact of a certain dino. Dinosaur's Rage wouldn't move the needle at all on structure decks of the era, simply reprinting MST, Storm, and Vortex, being the least amount of staple reprints thus far. It did also reprint Hydrogeddon, which following its minor success on the SJC stage, did spark a small rise in popularity of Hydrogeddon Beatdown. This could be clearly seen at SJC Seattle a week later on October 28, 2006, where Hydrogeddon Beatdown would see a rise in popularity, taking 2 of the top 8 spots. This wasn't enough to trump Monarch control, which still held the majority of the top spots at 3, and the winning deck piloted by Kyle Lopez, who maxed out his copies of both Thessalos and Zaborg alongside his Apprentice Magician package. The most interesting top from this tournament though was the single top from Machine OTK, which is a combination of Cyberstein OTK, which was already consistently popular, and the new Chimera Tech OTK, which synergized well with the machine support already present in the Cyberstein builds. The ever-growing popularity of Cyberstein though was coming to a head, as the deck was consistently ending within the top 8 of SJCs, even winning one, and it seemed like with the next core set release, that was about to get worse. Cyberdark Impact. Release date, November 15th, 2006. Set type, Core Set. Major strategies, Cyberdark, Chain, Stun. Impact, the butt of jokes. Cyberdark Impact, for better or worse, is the butt of many jokes in the community as one of the worst sets in the game's history, and that's even with the many duds throughout this year. However, that really isn't fair towards Impact, as with time, this particular set has aged extremely well, for better or worse, as many of the pieces from the set would go on to shape many formats of later eras. The Cyberdarks, however, were not among these well-aged pieces, being a series of level 4 machines that equipped a level 3 or lower dragon from grave to them on normal summon to gain attack. Unsurprisingly, the deck did absolutely nothing, as the best targets for the time were either Hunter Dragon, a vanilla, or Twin-Headed Behemoth, who was limited. And even with these targets, the monsters did absolutely nothing. Even their boss monster, Cyberdark Dragon, did absolutely nothing, being too difficult to summon and seemingly clashing with the design of the lower leveled monsters. As for cards from the set that would see some forms of relevance, Snipe Hunter was probably one of the most notable for the era, able to discard a card for a 2/3 chance to destroy any targetable card on field, able to use its effect as many times as desired. The Vanities were also released here, being Vanity's Fiend, a 1 tribute monster that locked all special summoning while on field, and Vanity's Ruler, a 2 tribute monster who locked just the opponent's special summoning. Speaking of special summon locking, the Barrier Statues were also released here, a series of monsters that lock special summoning while on field to only their attribute, seeing play based on which strategies were popular in their respective formats. A new rogue level contender would be discovered here too with Chain Burn, a deck focused on making incredibly long chain links to get the maximum value out of their new cards like Chain Strike, which burned the opponent's life points equal to its chain link times 400, and Accumulated Fortune, which drew 2 cards as long as it was used as chain link 4 or higher. Both of these had restrictions on them that they couldn't be activated in a chain that already had 2 cards of the same name in them, but that restriction doesn't stop someone from chaining a second copy to a no duplicate chain at the end to stack an additional effect. Blackhorn of Heaven negated an inherent special summon for effectively free, which would eventually see popularity as inherent summons became more popular leading into the next era of the game. Lastly, and probably most importantly for our modern understanding of the game, Instant Fusion was a spell that could fusion summon a level 5 or lower fusion for the cost of just 1000 life points, but it was destroyed during the end phase. This particular card was laughed at in its time, as the most relevant monster that could be summoned with it, Thousand Eyes Restrict, had just been banned on the last ban list, so why would you ever consider using this? Instant Fusion is one of those cards that aged incredibly well with the passage of time into later eras, but that will be covered much later when it comes up again in a few years. As for the current format, SJC Anaheim took place on November 18, 2006, and it would show just how much of a dud this new set was for the short term. Human Farubash would win the day using Monarch with an Apprentice Magician package, like lists from previous events, but there were a couple of interesting developments from this event. The first of these was the rise in popularity of Dark World, which would use Dark World Lightning to either force out a back row piece or pop a back row piece or set monster, then discard either Silva or Gold, providing a massive swing and advantage with the large monsters. The other was the first top of Macro Monarchs, a strategy that aimed to combine the previously released DD Scout Plane and Survivor with the recently released Macrocosmos and Dimensional Fissure, creating an infinite tribute engine for your Monarch summons that could actually pack a punch compared to Treeborn Frog, which this also happened to counter out. Safe to say, with the banning of the Chaos pieces, the meta was finally developing again in interesting directions, which would be accented by the release of the last set of the year. Dark Revelation Volume 3. Release date, November 25th, 2006. Set type, reprint set. Major strategies, Soul of the Duelist to the Lost Millennium. Impact, cheaper cards from the last year. Dark Revelation Volume 3 came in at the end of the year to reprint a lot of cards from 2004 to 2005, similar to the previous Beginnings and Revelation sets. Notable reprints here included the Horus line, Mystic Swordsman Level 2, Ninja Grandmaster Sasuke, Mobius and Thessalos, Mirage Dragon, Dekoichi, Nephthys, Rescue Cat, Lightning Vortex, Threatening Roar, Phoenix Wing Wind Blast, Deck Dev, DD Survivor, and BrainCon, all of which had seen minor to major success in the SJC scene. Speaking of, following this would be the last SJC event of the year in San Jose on December 16, 2006, and with it would be the birth of an all-new deck into the meta thanks to Cyberdark Impact, being Chain Burn, a deck that aimed to take advantage of the various burn cards in the game like Secret Barrel and Wave Motion Cannon with the newly released Chain Strike and Accumulated Fortune. In addition to this, Apprentice Monarch would take a dominant control of the meta, claiming 4 of the top 8 spots, but wouldn't win the day overall. That would go to David Rodriguez, playing Cyberstein OTK in its second SJC win, sparking a serious amount of controversy around the titular card, not only in reference to its consistent OTK strategy, but its usage in practically every deck in the meta as a cleanup tool for ending games out of nowhere. This culminated in an extremely significant moment in the game's history, the first ever emergency ban list. The following week, on December 21st, 2006, Cyberstein would be banned from competitive play as an added addition to the previous September ban list. It made sense that this would happen, as Cyberstein OTK had consistently claimed at least one top 8 slot in every SJC since August, and Cyberstein itself had shown up in most decks ending in those top 8 positions due to its utility as a surprise game ender. With the banning of Stein, 2006 Yu-Gi-Oh! Came to a close, and though many of the sets in the year changed to nothing overall, this could be seen as the calm before the storm. Major changes were on the way to the metagame of Yu-Gi-Oh!, as the GX era was approaching its first true strategy shakeups with the introduction of a few new monsters that would change the power level of the game forever. Structure Deck Machine Revolt. Release date, January 17th, 2007. Set type, Structure Deck. Major strategies, Ancient Gear, Gadget. Impact, the power of normal summons. Machine Revolt, being a structure deck in the GX era, was expected to bring nothing of note to the game, similar to structure deck releases of 2006. However, Revolt did something no structure deck before it ever had. It had impactful new cards. Red, green, and yellow Gadget were all released in this structure deck, and with them came a resource loop that was unmatched by any no tribute normal summon prior, an endless conga line of bodies. With each Gadget searching one of the other 2 on summon, you effectively had 9 bodies you could gain off the summon of a single monster, and with them being machine, they instantly synergized with the list in the format already playing Chimera Tech Overdragon OTK lines. In addition to this, the deck also released Ancient Gear Gachilotron Dragon, who wasn't impactful to the meta at this point in time, but was notable for being an ancient gear, high attack monster that did not have a special summon lock written on it, which would make it relevant with the release of future ancient gear support. In addition to these, reprints of MST, Limiter Removal, Heavy Storm, Enemy Controller, Pot of Avarice, Ultimate Offering, and Sakuretsu Armor were also present, rounding out this already stacked structure deck. The impact of this release would be immediately felt with SJC Orlando on January 27th, seeing 2 of the top 8 being the newly released Gadget Control deck. Machine OTK would still be the go-to deck for the format, taking 3 top spots, but wouldn't, or would, depending on your definition, win the day overall, seeing Paul Lin take first place with the Dimension Fusion Turbo list, using the Ancient Gear monsters in combination with Ancient Gear Drill to quickly grab power spells from the deck, like Future, Overload, and Dimension Fusion, using the Chimeratech OTK line as an engine piece for Dimension Fusion plays. He would also be the first player to receive the new SJC prize card, Crush Card Virus, which was recognizably powerful on reveal, but thankfully there wasn't a deck that could take full advantage of it in the meta, right? Duelist Packs Jaden Yuki 2 and Aster Phoenix. Release date February 7th, 2007. Set type Duelist Packs. Major strategies Elemental Hero, Destiny Hero. Impact, changing the fate of the Duelist Packs. Jaden 2 and Aster were, at first glance, expected to turn out like the Duelist Packs from 2006, being reprints of cards that didn't need a reprint or new cards that weren't impactful. While that is true for most of the cards between them, there were a couple of cards in these packs that would go on to affect the meta for the remainder of the year. In Jaden 2, we received Card Trooper, a 400 attack machine that could mill 3 once per turn to gain 1500 attack that turn, and replaced himself with a draw on destruction. Trooper was instantly recognized as insanely powerful, initially being concocted to either be a Chimeratech OTK enabler or a Bazoo Return enabler, which was only boosted by it only having 400 attack. This low attack value meant that it could be used with machine duplication, making it far more explosive than anyone could have predicted. In Aster Phoenix, a couple of new cards were released for his Destiny Hero strategy, being Destiny Hero Malicious, who could banish himself from grave to summon another copy from deck, and Destiny Draw, which could discard a Destiny Hero to draw 2. These two would instantly be considered for a deck with Destiny Hero Diamond Dude, known as Diamond Dude Turbo in the community, which focused on the use of the titular monster to cheat the cost requirements of powerful spells to simply gain their effects. But this wouldn't be the only set of cards to enable it. We're gonna need to take a quick detour here away from Jaden 2 and Aster Phoenix to discuss a rather important cornerstone of Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole, Shonen Jump. The manga publication had been running Yu-Gi-Oh! And its related series since its creation in 1996, and with that came the desire to promote the game itself within the publication. Starting in January 2003, and every few months after, Shonen Jump would occasionally release a promo card within the magazine, usually a reprint of a popular card, but sometimes a unique card exclusive to the publication, such as Unity, Yugioh Friendship, and Judgment of the Pharaoh. Usually, these amounted to extremely niche play, if at all, with the closest one at this point being Victory Dragon due to its match-winning clause causing headaches in official tournaments due to the rules around when a player can concede a game. This all changed with the release of the April 2007 issue, which brought the promo card Elemental Hero Stratos, who either searched for a hero or popped spells and traps up to the number of your other heroes on summon. At the time garnering the nickname of Blue Gadget due to its similar effect, Stratos was instantly recognized as powerful thanks to its ability to search out not only other hero monsters, but also additional copies of itself, making it an 1800 beater that could replace itself on summon, similar to the gadget monsters that were already getting popular. There was just one issue. We were never supposed to get him in this capacity. Stratos would be limited on the March 2007 ban list, setting him to 1 before his official release date of April 21st. However, anyone who has ever received Shonen Jump in the mail knows that their release dates almost never adhere to the actual date you'd receive your issue, commonly receiving issues about 2 months before their actual release date. Because of this, and the fact that the game had no legalization date for unreleased cards at this point in time, once people received their issues of Shonen Jump by mail, Stratos was legal to use in the TCG. This colossal mistake would be seen firsthand at SJC St. Louis on February 24th, where 5 of the top 8 decks were playing Stratos at its full 3 copies. Diamond Dew Turbo would be the standout deck of the event, also winning the event piloted by Carlo Perez, using the effect of Diamond Dew to consistently use power spells without paying their costs, like Dimension Fusion, Destiny Draw, Lightning Vortex, Monster Gate, and Reasoning. In addition to this, Divine Sword Phoenix Blade was a common piece of the deck to be used as both discard fodder for your various spells, and as a way to banish your monsters for use with Dimension Fusion. This extremely short-lived version of the deck, due to the use of Phoenix Blade with triple Stratos, garnered the nickname of Airblade, which is still looked back upon as one of the major mistakes of the game's early years and is commonly believed to be why we have set legalization dates to this day. Though Airblade's reign was short-lived, its impact was felt widely across the player base, leading into the first core release of 2007. Strike of Neos. Release date, February 28, 2007. Set type, Core Set. Major strategies, Neos, 6 Samurai, Counter Fairy. Impact, big changes to the TCG core sets. Strike of Neos is an interesting set not only for its contents, but also for what it changed for the TCG core sets moving forward. The first of these changes was the reintroduction of secret rares to core sets, bringing the now iconic cross-foil designs to the TCG as an update to the previous versions of the rarity. The second was the introduction of TCG exclusives to the game, highlighted in the new archetype of 6 Samurai, a series of monsters focused around gaining strong effects as long as 2 or more were on the field at the same time. While in the OCG, the strategy never really took hold due to needing to normal summon 2 separate monsters to gain the effects, the first TCG exclusive ever would solve this issue in Grandmaster of the 6 Samurai, who could special summon himself if you control the 6 Samurai, had the same stats as Cyber Dragon, and added a 6 Samurai from grave to hand if destroyed by an opponent's card effect, which could include itself. This addition made 6 Samurai a potential strategy in the TCG, establishing that these new TCG exclusive cards could shift the deck's viability practically on their own. The last was the introduction of OCG imports to core sets, dedicating the last few slots of a set list to bringing in cards from the OCG that we otherwise would have no way of obtaining, since our sets are different. This first batch would be the exclusive cards from the OCG structure deck Surge of Radiance, which was never imported to the TCG, bringing new cards like Neo Parshath, the Sky Paladin, Meltiel, Sage of the Sky, Harvest Angel of Wisdom, Freya, Spirit of Victory, Nova Summoner, Radiant Gerald, Jalenduo, and Aegis of Gaia. This particular change would be extremely contentious, as not only were these cards not imported via the structure deck they were supposed to be in, making them more expensive to obtain all around, but they were also released entirely as secret rares, which at the time held a ratio of roughly 1 per box, making the strategy of counter fairies that these cards enabled prohibitively expensive to play in the TCG, even though it was arguably worse than the current meta. Aside from these changes, there were still many impactful cards released in this particular set. Starting with the set's namesake, Neos would receive new forms in Air, Grand, and Glow Neos, along with the release of their Neospatian counterparts. While this did nothing for the Neos deck's placement in the meta, Neospatian Grand Mole itself would be a rather interesting addition to the game, giving players a card that could temporarily remove big threats from the board at the cost of a normal summon and battle phase. But the biggest part was that it was repeatable, as it returned itself to the hand with this effect too. Dark World would receive further support here, most of which wouldn't change anything about the deck, but the card Dark World Dealings would do the strategy a lot of good, letting both players draw 1 and discard 1. In reality, this particular card would become an integral piece for various FTK strategies, as it provided draw power in many cases where other cards wouldn't. DD Crow would be one of the first relevant hand traps ever released, allowing you to discard it to banish any 1 card from the opponent's graveyard, seeing side deck play in various formats. In a similar vein, Electric Virus, Puppet Plant, and Marionette Might would all be monsters with the ability to be discarded to take control of monsters of a specific type that turn, seeing usage as side deck options for certain threats within a format. Advanced Ritual Art was a new generic ritual spell, able to pay the cost of any ritual monster using normal monsters in the deck, circumventing the need for the tributes in hand or on field, which would see significant play shortly after this release. Lastly, pulling the rug was a counter trap that negated the effects of a monster that were activated upon its normal summon and destroyed it, which was practically handcrafted for countering out monarchs, whose effects were mandatory and could not avoid this trap, seeing immediate side deck play for the various monarch strategies in the format. The day after Strike of Neos' release, a new ban list went into effect, making a number of changes to the metagame. Newly banned were Breaker the Magical Warrior, one of the most generically played monsters of the era, Magician of Faith, as her spell recycle ability was consistently too good, Victory Dragon, as his match-winning effect was becoming a nuisance to structured play, Graceful Charity, as it was arguably more powerful than Pot of Greed, which had been banned for a while now, and Last Will, as it enabled too many overpowered strategies with its generically free summon. Newly limited were Stratos, as it was meant to be from day one, Grand Mole, as a repeatable bounce may prove to be an issue if left unchecked, Chain Strike, as Chain Burn was a threat to the meta that might have been too much at the time, and led most to side Death's Wombat specifically for it, Dimension Fusion, as decks abusing the card were abundant, Giant Trunade, as the back row removal options shouldn't be widely accessible, Overload Fusion, as Chimeratech OTK strategies were abundant, Snatch Steal, bringing the power spell back to 1, Crush Card Virus, as the SJC prize card could pose an issue at 3, and Mind Crush, as the hand knowledge it provided at the time was immensely powerful. Semi-limited were DD Assailant, as warrior decks were not as powerful anymore, Mask of Darkness, as its effect was not as strong as Magician of Faiths, and Metamorphosis, as fusion cheatouts had been in decline since Thousand Eyes Restrict and Cyberstein's bans. Lastly, Unlimited were Exiled Force for the same reason as DD Assailant, Injection Fairy Lily as her time had passed, Sacred Phoenix of Nephthys for the same reason, and Upstart Goblin as almost no one was playing this draw tool, though in hindsight absolutely should have been. SJC Houston would be the first event played under these new releases and ban list, taking place on March 3rd, and the meta had certainly been shifted by all of these changes to the point where it wasn't clear what the best deck was, seeing 7 different strategies land in the top 8. Amon Ganon would take yet another SJC title with Bazoo return, notably switching the copies he lost of Dimension Fusion out for Return from the Different Dimension, which took an additional turn of setup being a trap, but was also only affecting himself. This format was still clearly up in the air, and many turned to the next set to see if something would change. Duelist Pack Zane Truesdale. Release date, March 7th, 2007. Set type, Duelist Pack. Major strategies, Cyber Dragon. Impact, reprinting the machines. Duelist Pack Zane came out just about a week too late to be really relevant, as its major reprints, Cyber Dragon and its fusions, Future Fusion, and Overload Fusion were mostly part of the Chimeratech OTK, which had just been significantly hit on the ban list with the limiting of Overload Fusion. On top of that, its new cards, Cyber Laser and Barrier Dragon, were completely dead on arrival, meaning this set really held no significance in the meta at large outside of a Cyber Dragon reprint. Far more importantly than Duelist Pack Zane was the release of the DS game World Championship 2007, which brought the promo card Destiny Hero Disc Commander to the game, who let the player draw 2 when he summoned from grave. This card would be a perfect match with Diamond Dude Turbo in the current meta, as it was yet another good Destiny draw target that heavily benefited from the addition of more Grave Revival tools to the deck, like Call of the Haunted, though wouldn't be played on initial release. SJC Columbus would take place just 4 days later on March 24th, and although the meta was starting to trend towards the Monarch side of things, a few new faces had appeared in the lineup. The first of these was Trooper Monarch, which aimed to use Card Trooper to fill the grave with tools like Treeborn Frog for Monarch summons while also holding pressure with its boosted 1900 attack and replacement on destruction. The second was Six Samurai, making its first appearance in the metagame, and interestingly was doing something no other deck was playing at the time: 3 Card Trooper and Machine Duplication. This particular strategy, known as Troop Dupe Scoop, would become integral to the format as it proceeded, as many decks were playing the Troop Dupe Scoop in some capacity moving forward thanks to the raw advantage it provided. The last new deck in this lineup, and probably the most interesting, was Demise OTK, a deck dedicated to performing the ritual summon of Demise King of Armageddon to clear the board, then use a number of different ways to reach 8,000 damage and end the game with. Notably, the deck played Advanced Ritual Art to summon Demise, opting to dump level 4 insects for the summon to fuel the summon condition of Doomdozer. Between Doomdozer, Megamorph, and Metamorphosis, finding lethal for the deck was surprisingly easy, as it would be morphed and modified over the remainder of the format. Mark Glass would win the event with Diamond Dew Turbo, continuing the previous game plan of the deck involving Phoenix Blade and Dimension Fusion, though notably less powerful now with the limiting of Stratos and Dimension Fusion. SJC Montreal would follow on April 14th, and with it Monarch Control would slowly establish itself as the meta king, though it was still very much a grab for power all around. Cesar Gonzalez would win the event with the aforementioned Monarchs, playing a total of 8 Monarchs in the deck, a slightly heavier count than the usual 7. Most notably for his build though, he was playing 3 Brain Control, using it as a way to offset his Monarch's tribute cost. SJC Anaheim would be held 2 weeks later on April 28th, and with it we'd see a significant rise in the popularity of the Demise OTK, seeing a couple of new innovations to the deck, with the most prominent being the inclusion of Metal Armored Bug to pay the full cost of Advanced Ritual Art rather than 2 level 4 insects. Michael Songlok would win the event with the aforementioned Demise OTK, also opting to play Contract with the Abyss to ritual summon Demise the normal way. The only other list worth noting from this event was a single Trooper Hero list, which seemed to be focused more on Hero's graveyard effects rather than its Diamond Dude strategy, notably being the first topping appearance of Disc Commander. All of this would lead into the next core set, and with it, new resource engines to add to the already powerful pile we've seen thus far. Force of the Breaker. Release date, May 16th, 2007. Set type, Core Set. Major strategies, Volcanic, Sky Scourge, Virus. Impact, the King of Monarchs. Force of the Breaker, following Strike of Neos' return to form with core sets, had rather large shoes to fill. While it may not have had the depth of cards that Strike brought before it, it did arguably have the strongest card in its grip from either set, which we'll get to soon enough. Starting with the set's headliner, Volcanics were a series of pyro monsters aimed at using their weaker monsters like Shell and Scattershot as monster removal with the spell Blaze Accelerator. Shell in particular came across as useful thanks to its effect to add an additional copy from deck to hand once per turn while it was in the graveyard, making it a discard engine even outside of the Volcanic deck itself, which saw no meta relevance. What made an engine of the cards far more appealing was the second ever TCG exclusive card Volcanic Rocket, which searched Blaze Accelerator when summoned, making a splashable Volcanic package desirable for some decks. Crystal Beasts were a series of monsters that turn into continuous spells when destroyed on field, seeing interest as a resource engine, but at the time had no real payoffs. Sapphire Pegasus and Ruby Carbuncle would see experimentation as monster generators thanks to Ruby Carbuncle's effect in combination with Crystal Promise. But aside from this, the only meta relevance the deck would have for a period of time would be thanks to Topaz Tiger, who boosted himself to 2000 attack while attacking, seeing play as a beater. The Sky Scourge monsters operated more like a balanced version of the previous Chaos Envoy monsters, with Enrise being a rebalanced BLS, having an effect closer in application to Chaos Sorcerer, and Norellas being a rebalanced Chaos Emperor Dragon, having no burn effect but allowing you to draw 1 on resolution. These monsters' summoning restrictions are far more difficult to achieve than their Envoy counterparts, requiring a 3-1 split of Light Fairies and Dark Fiends depending on which you were summoning. In addition, Invincible had the effect of either Jinzo or Spell Canceller, depending on whether you summoned it by tributing a Light Fairy or a Dark Fiend. The Diabolos monsters were imported from the OCG here, once again bringing a structure deck from the OCG and importing all of its cards as secret rare, with the caveat of its deck not really being great at all, as none of its monsters synergized with each other particularly well. It did bring one piece of interest though in Eradicator Epidemic Virus, which served as the virus counterpart to Crush Card Virus and Deck Devastation Virus that covered spells and traps. This would see similar experimentation to Deck Devastation due to the similar tribute requirements. A series of monsters would be released here that could all be discarded to search for corresponding field spells, being 2100 attack beaters under those field spells. These included Elemental Hero Captain Gold, Gravekeeper's Commandant, Warrior of Atlantis, Destroyer Saurus, Zera Diaz, Herald of the Heaven, Archfiend General, and Harpy Queen. Notably, the ones that are 2100 without the field spell active have some form of drawback to where they can't be used without the field spell, to prevent their usage as generic beaters. Lastly, and most importantly, the strongest card in the set was unquestionably Ryza the Storm Monarch, a new monarch that placed any card on field on top of its owner's deck on Tribute Summon. With Monarch already being a powerhouse in the meta, Ryza instantly found its place, being unquestionably the best Monarch as it not only temporarily removed a threat, but it also blanked an opponent's draw on the next turn, as they were guaranteed to draw back into whatever you remove. This change was slow to be seen as we entered into a long stretch of back-to-back tournaments, being the Nationals season, starting with SJC Philadelphia on May 19th. Around this point in record keeping, deck lists for top 16 would be made available from SJCs moving forward, with some national championships following suit, but not all. Taking a total of 9 of the 16 top spots, Monarch variants dominated this SJC, particularly with a new variant being referred to as Perfect Circle Monarch, which aimed to use the Destiny heroes as a draw engine and as bodies for tribute fodder for your Monarchs, being one of the breakout successes of Disc Commander in the format, instantly netting a +2 from being revived from the grave. Jesse Samek would take first place with Perfect Circle Monarch, establishing the concept as a go-to strategy for the format. This was shortly followed by the UK Nationals on May 26th, where the differences in player tendencies between continents was apparent from the top 8 spread. Off-the-wall decks like Chainburn, Earthbeat, and Rat Toolbox all managed to take a top spot without a single Perfect Circle list in sight. Andrew Lamb would take first place here with Rat Toolbox, specifically taking advantage of the recently unlimited Exiled Force and the power of Card Trooper. 5 days later on June 1st, a new ban list would go into effect, being a rather small list overall, but with 2 major hits. The first was the Green Baboon Defender of the Forest, a Shonen Jump promo due out in July that had caused major headaches in the OCG due to its effect, limiting it prior to its official release. The second was Magical Stone Excavation, limiting it, and with it, lowering the power level of Diamond Dude Turbo significantly, as now it couldn't freely regain its spells with Diamond Dude's effect. These changes were in effect for SJC Minneapolis the next day on June 2nd, where a sudden spike in the popularity of Trooper Hero would occur, aiming to use Card Trooper and Destiny Draw to load Destiny Hero pieces into the graveyard like Malicious and Dasher, providing significant advantage. In addition to this, Minneapolis was the point in time where Ryza began to show up in most Monarch lists, usually maxing out at 3 copies, as its power level had finally been realized by the player base. Shane Scurry would win the event with Trooper Hero, which also showed a growing interest in Snipe Hunter as a removal option in the meta, giving a 2/3 chance at removing a card on field for the cost of a discard, which was usually helpful for the deck running Malicious and Dasher. Canadian Nationals was soon after on June 16th, with Monarch builds taking 5 of the top 8, but wouldn't win the day overall. That honor went to Dexter Dalit, playing a gadget list with interesting inclusions not commonly found in gadget control, like the Future and Overload Fusion combo for Chimera Tech OTK pushes, Banisher of the Radiance for locking off the graveyard, and a reappearance from Snipe Hunter to take advantage of the gadget's advantage generation. US Nationals would follow the next weekend on June 23rd, and Aggro Machine lists would make a massive rise in popularity thanks to Troop Dupe Scoop catching on as an incredible resource engine, able to effectively net at least 9 mills and up to 3 draws off your troopers thanks to the combination. This was also now being used in combination with Magical Explosion to OTK opponents thanks to the spells the combination would load into the graveyard, taking one of the top 16 spots here. Adam Korn would win the event with a Trooper Monarch list that was lacking the Troop Dupe Scoop combo, but was notably playing triple Ryza, recognizing the power level of the boss as unquestionably the best Monarch. The following weekend was the European Championships on June 30th, and Trooper lists had fully taken hold as the most popular deck in the region. David Bellaccio would win the event with Trooper Hero, notably playing 39 of the same 40 cards played by Shane Scurry in Minneapolis, only missing the Crush Card Virus, which was understandable considering the card was still an SJC prize card. Leaving the national circuit, SJC Phoenix was next on July 7th, and even with the meta becoming increasingly centralized around Troop Dupe Scoop, the spread of representation in the top 16 was still as diverse as ever. The Razak Punsumbat would claim the SJC victory playing Aggro Machine, using a copy of the Light Hex Sealed Fusion to potentially access copies of Cyber Twin and End Dragon in the extra deck. Last for the gauntlet of tournaments, SJC Detroit would take place on July 14th, where Philly Luna would claim his second SJC title using Trooper Monarch, notably only playing Ryza in his Monarch line. Around the same time, Green Baboon was finally released to the TCG via its Shonen Jump promotion, but would make almost zero impact due to its limitation prior to the release in the TCG, notably different than its performance in the OCG. This long streak of event after event would finally be broken up by a couple of releases before the World Championship in 2 weeks, but whether they would bring anything useful was extremely doubtful. Starter decks Jaden, Yuki, and Syrus Truesdale. Release date July 25th, 2007. Set type Starter deck. Major strategies Hero, Roid. Impact Reprinting the reprinted. The 2007 starter decks would do exactly what all starter decks do, bringing maybe 1 or 2 new cards in total and reprint a bunch of cards that have been reprinted several times before. On the docket of new cards, we have Elemental Hero Necroshade and Express Roid, both of which did jack all to help their respective strategies. As for reprints, Dekoichi, Drillroid, Exiled Force, Giant Trunade, Heavy Storm, Book of Moon, Smashing Ground, Lightning Vortex, Brain Control, Compulsory Evacuation Device, and Sakuretsu Armor would all see reprints here, with most if not all already having easy access reprints. This set was just as quickly forgotten, as the very next day, another set would be released that even had some cards that people cared about. Premium Pack. Release date July 26, 2007. Set type Import set. Major strategies Random OCG table scraps. Impact 1 squishy wall. Premium Pack at the time was an oddly received set, as it was the first of its kind, an OCG import set that only aimed to bring in the odd cards that were left out of our releases. While most famously this included Magician of Black Chaos, a couple of cards here would see some relevance in the meta overall. Marshmallow was an immune to battle destruction wall that burned the opponent for 1,000 the first time it's attacked into, immediately seeing play as a stalling tool for some strategies in the meta. Gemini Imps could be discarded to negate hand-ripping effects and replaced itself after, useful for the odd strategies that aimed to do so in later formats. And lastly, Legacy of Yatagarasu was essentially copies 4, 5, and 6 of Jar of Greed, with a random upside staple to it, seeing interchangeable play with Jar and decks that opted for it. This would be the final release before the World Championships on July 28th, held in San Diego, California, USA. Monarchs and Machine strategies would once again hold the dominant position in the meta thanks to Ryza and Card Trooper respectively, both being seen in Andres Toro of Chile's winning deck list Trooper Monarch, maxing out Ryza and including the Troop Dupe Scoop package. The landscape of the World Championships wouldn't last too long though, as the next core set was around the corner, and it was aiming to shake up the game with its new monster mechanic that was practically doomed to fail out the starting gate. Tactical Evolution. Release date August 15th, 2007. Set type Core set. Major strategies Gemini, Venom, Zombies. Impact, a couple of standouts, nothing game-breaking. Tactical Evolution, being the third core set in a year that seemed to have major impact come from their core sets, was shockingly a bit of a dud compared to its contemporaries. The main reason for this was most likely due to its highlighted new monster subcategory, Gemini, a series of monsters that are considered normal monsters on the field and in the grave, but can be normal summoned a second time to gain an effect. This initial wave included Elemental Hero Neosalius, Chthonian Emperor Dragon, Aquarian Alessa, Lucky Pied Piper, Grass Chopper, Goggle Golem, Dawnbreak Gardna, Doom Shaman, King Pyron, Shadow Delver, Phantom Dragon Ray Bronto, Illblood, and Blazewing Butterfly. Of this wave, practically all of these would be complete duds with the exception of 2. The first of these was Elemental Hero Neosalius, who wasn't even used for its Gemini status, but instead because it was a 1900 beater, light attribute, a hero, and was considered a normal monster in grave for certain hero cards. The other was Illblood, who was actually used for its effect thanks to the other zombie support piece in this set, Zombie Master, giving zombies a significant boost in their grave recursion, which melded nicely with Card of Safe Return, gaining a ton of advantage off summoning from grave. The Chrysalis series were counterparts to the Neospatians that saw absolutely no play, similar to the other Neospatian support piece, Nex, aimed to be used to turn Neospatian monsters into souped up versions from the extra deck, with its only target in this set being Marine Dolphin. However, this would flop too, as only 2 monsters were ever printed for this particular enabler, leaving it dead in the water. The last archetype introduced here were Venoms, a series of monsters that aim to place Venom counters, which when mixed with their field spell Venom Swamp, dropped monsters' attack by 500 for each, destroying any that hit 0 attack this way. Venoms, however, were extremely scattered in their execution, leaving the deck completely dead on arrival. Moving into more standalone cards, Frost and Flame Dragon and Desert Twister were experimentations in doing new pseudo-chaos monsters, requiring Water and Fires for Frost and Flame Dragon's case, and Wind and Earths in Desert Twisters, but both would be subpar in the metagame. Necrogardna was a new dark monster that could be banished from the grave to negate an attack of an opponent's monster, seeing use occasionally as both an attack blocker and a crush card enabler. And lastly, Crystal Seer was a weaker statted version of Dekoichi that gave more control of the card drawn by giving you 2 options, also being marked as potentially powerful thanks to it being summonable through Apprentice Magician. SJC Indianapolis took place that weekend, seeing Crush Card retired from its prize card position and being replaced by Gold Sarcophagus, which was also powerful in its own right. While Machine and Monarch strategies continued to dominate the landscape here, Kenny So would take the first copy of Gold Sark with Drain Burn, aimed at using popular stall tools and skill drain to wait out wave motion cannon turns. This would also be the last tournament of what was known as Trooper format, as a new set and a new ban list were just around the corner to shake things up significantly. Collectible Tins 2007. Release date August 29th, 2007. Set type Yearly Tins. Major strategies, reprinting the sets of the last year. Impact, a single relevant promo. As per usual at this stage, the Yearly Tins brought with them 6 promo cards, most of which were reprints of chase cards from sets of the last year or so. This time though, 2 of these tins were headlined by new cards, but only one of them would ever see meta viability. Destiny Hero Plasma could be special summoned by tributing 3 monsters, had a Relinquish style monster stealing effect, and was effectively skill drained for the opponent's activated effects, seeing plays in decks already using Stratos as a tech choice. In addition to this release, the September 2007 ban list took effect on September 1st, and with it would come a major blow to the meta at large. Banned were Confiscation, Metamorphosis, Snatch Steal, and Ring of Destruction, all of which had caused their own headaches in the meta, and many cheered to see them finally go with the other broken spells and traps of the DM era. Limited were Breaker the Magical Warrior, as the card being banned made little sense before, Card Trooper, as it was the cornerstone of the meta, Disc Commander, as Perfect Circle decks were really starting to catch on to his power level, Magician of Faith, bringing her back from 0, Marshmallow due to its burn and battle immunity, Snipe Hunter, as the discard cost to pop was often just as good as the pop itself, Brain Control being one of the few remaining power spells, Fissure for God knows what reason, Gold Sark to prevent a meta takeover from an SJC prize card, Smashing Ground as it was a staple removal spell, Transmigration Prophecy for the mill recycling, Trap Dust Shoot for its spin back and hand knowledge it gave, and Wall of Revealing Light for stalling and for causing numerous headaches for tournaments. Semi-limited were Malicious, starting its forever semi status, Green, Yellow, and Red Gadget to limit their resource engine, Royal Decree for its general trap stopping power, and Jinzo, Noblemen of Crossout, and Pot of Avarice, easing their statuses. Lastly, unlimited were DD Assailant, Protector of the Sanctuary, Deck Devastation Virus, and Good Goblin Housekeeping, as all were seen as acceptable for the current meta. SJC Washington DC would be the first real test of the new meta on September 15th, seeing a wide variety of decks in the top 16, but with one particular standout deck performing well. Zombies, on the back of the recently hampered meta, had risen as a powerful option thanks to Zombie Master and Illblood's synergy with Card of Safe Return, providing an insane amount of advantage from their resources. Jonathan LaBounty would win the day on Perfect Circle Monarch, showing the continued power of the Monarchs with the Destiny Hero package, as it had changed very little if at all from the last ban list. 2 weeks later, with SJC Chicago on September 29th, a new trend would also start really taking hold, being the presence of the previously mentioned Drain Burn, even taking first place piloted by Louis Raimondo, who opted to max out copies of Dimension Wall to serve as 3 copies of Magic Cylinder when being attacked directly. SJC Durham would see similar shiftings on October 13th, with Perfect Circle Monarch and Zombie variants fighting to take back major representation, with Zombie taking the event piloted by Philip Anthony, maxing out his copies of Card of Safe Return, as there was no form of once per turn restriction on the card. This would be the second to last event for the year, with one more taking place after a couple of new set releases, and these were bound to shake up the meta thanks to introducing some cards that would become integral for the next few formats. Structure Deck Rise of the Dragon Lords. Release date October 24th, 2007. Set type Structure Deck. Major strategies Dragons. Impact a staple for years to come. Rise of the Dragon Lords was initially looked at for its new dragon synergies, although most of them ended up flopping on release, like Felgrand and Darkblaze dragons, who were too underwhelming to be considered viable boss monsters. Decoy Dragon was probably the most interesting monster released here, summoning a dragon from grave when attacked and swapping the attack target to that monster, but was still underwhelming with other ways to out it in the format. However, a couple of new spells would see play outside of this strategy. Trade-In was a massive new draw power, able to discard a level 8 monster to draw 2 cards, which would see play in decks like Demise OTK to help ease bricks in the hand. However, by far the most impactful introduction here was a spell called Foolish Burial, which let you send any monster from deck to grave, which was already incredibly useful for decks like Perfect Circle and Zombie, but would take a little time to catch on. In addition to this, reprints included here were Morphing Jar, Soul Exchange, Giant Trunade, Premature Burial, Lightning Vortex, Brain Control, Call the Haunted, and Sakuretsu Armor, some of which, like Morphing Jar, were incredibly well received. On the note of reprints, there was yet another major reprint set just around the corner that aimed to bring the price of the game down significantly. Dark Revelation Volume 4. Release date November 14th, 2007. Set type Reprint Set. Major strategies Cybernetic Revolution to Enemy of Justice. Impact reprinting a couple of promos. Revelations 4 effectively was no different from the previous Revelation sets, bringing card-for-card reprints of the cards from its set list. However, it did also bring reprints of cards that were at this point only available as promos in one way or another, like DD Assailant and Ixarian Universe, making it not completely pointless, but still lacking a major selling point. However, this was not the only set released this day, as the last core set of the year was also dropped on the 14th, and it would bring a few new tools that would only grow better with time. Gladiator's Assault. Release date November 14th, 2007. Set type Core Set. Major strategies Gladiator Beasts, Evil Hero, Cloudians. Impact a meta sleeper will soon awaken. Gladiator's Assault is quite the remarkable set in the long term of the game's history, as while it was mid on release, it would grow far more desirable in the span of a few months. This is largely thanks to Gladiator Beast, the set's headlining archetype, a series of monsters that return themselves to the deck at the end of battle phase if they battled to summon another one from deck, triggering some effect on summon. Notably, this release included Murmillo, Bestiari, Liquori, Haplomus, Dimikari, and Secutor, along with a few less notable ones, as well as their boss monster Heraklinos, who was a contact fusion of Liquori and 2 other Gladiator beasts, able to negate a spell or trap by discarding a card. They also received Test Tiger here in the OCG import slot, able to special summon itself from hand if you control a Gladiator beast, and tribute itself to initiate the tag out effect in the main phase, useful for tempo pushes. While an interesting strategy, Gladiator Beast wouldn't take to the meta immediately, but rather would be seen as a sleeper option, needing only that last bit of support to break out and take over. The third hero sub-archetype would be introduced here in Evil Hero, bringing cards like Malicious Edge, Infernal Gainer, Inferno Wing, Lightning Golem, and Dark Gaia, with their gimmick being the fusions could only be summoned with the spell Dark Fusion. These were a cobbled together mess of an archetype on release, although Dark Gaia specifically would see some experimentation in its own standalone OTK strategy thanks to needing any fiend and rock for its summon. Cloudians were a new archetype that, mostly, couldn't be destroyed by battle, auto-destroyed themselves in face-up defense, and manipulated fog counters to perform their control effects. While they were interesting, seeing some experimentation with Sanctuary in the Sky due to becoming walls, they'd make no real impact in the meta due to the burden that was counter generation. Gemini's received a couple of new pieces, most importantly Super Alloy Beast Raptinus, who made all Gemini monsters gain their effects while he's on the field, but this also did nothing to bring Gemini together as a strategy at the time. Necroface was an odd card that banished 5 from the top of both players' decks when banished, seeing the occasional experimentation as a mill strategy enabler. Light and Shadow Imprisoning Mirror were new continuous traps that locked the effects of light and dark monsters used on field or in grave, seeing significant side deck play for formats where those attributes were popular. Lastly for this set, Soul Taker was a new targeted removal option, destroying a monster and making the opponent gain 1000 life points when you did, which had the added benefit of making some monsters miss timing when destroyed this way. There was, however, one more release here that absolutely needs to be mentioned. With the release of the Yugioh GX manga volumes, they established that promo cards will be printed with them for use in the TCG, similar to Shonen Jump promos. Within Volume 1, released November 14th, came Light and Darkness Dragon, Chazz's ace monster in the manga, and was a serious threat on release, reducing its attack and defense by 500 to negate anything that activates, reviving a monster in grave on destruction. This card's impact would be immediate and powerful, with SJC San Mateo demonstrating its power on December 1st, with Perfect Circle adding the dragon to its lineup instantly and dominating with it, taking first place piloted by Philly Luna, claiming his 3rd SJC title and his 2nd for this year alone. While this would be the end, there would be one more release that happened that would impact the game as a whole, being the World Championship 2008 DS game, bringing the promo card Dimensional Prison to the game, being effectively a better version of Sakuretsu armor by banishing its affected monster instead of destroying it. This card would impact the structure of decks moving into 2008, where the game was about to speed up more than anyone had ever seen before, with the looming power of a new Tier 0 menace on the horizon, and the game about to rev up its engines with the introduction of a mechanic that would change the course of the game forever. Duelist packs Jaden Yuki 3 and Jesse Anderson. Release date January 26, 2008. Set type Duelist packs. Major strategies Evil Hero, Crystal Beasts. Impact problem cards in later eras. Jaden 3 and Jesse did practically nothing on release that would shake up the metagame, but they did include a couple of cards that would make waves as the game progressed forward into later eras. From Jaden 3, the primary focus was on the Evil Heroes released in the latter half of 2007, with a couple of new cards to boost the strategy like Infernal Prodigy, who could be special summoned if you controlled no monsters, being considerable as tribute fodder for some decks, and Dark Calling, a Miracle Fusion-like spell that banished materials from the hand or grave for Evil Heroes, treating the fusion as if it was done by Dark Fusion, seeing usage as an OTK enabler for Dark Gaia OTK decks that had occasionally popped up. For Jesse Anderson, the cards here would be more generically focused, like Hand Destruction and Grave Squirmer, seeing some experimentation at the time but no widespread play. However, it did also release 2 cards that would become an issue far later down the road, with Phantom Skyblaster and Grinder Golem, 2 monsters that could generate tokens in very different ways. Grinder Golem would see some experimentation at this point in time with the card Remove Brainwashing from Magician's Force, but mostly these 2 would be forgotten until around 2017 when a new era would bring them both back into the spotlight. SJC Orlando would take place the same day as these pack releases, and was extremely notable as the first true testing grounds for the recently released Dimensional Prison. While Perfect Circle Monarch would take the majority of top spots, Gadget had a particularly impressive showing here with the new Battle Trap in tow. Cedric Sequeira would win the day with Perfect Circle here, showcasing Light and Darkness Dragon with 2 copies in his main board. This would also be what is considered the end of Perfect Circle format, and rather abruptly too, as while the format was starting to show its true potential, the next core set would release 2 weeks later, and it would, without exaggeration, change everything about the game moving forward. Phantom Darkness. Release date, February 13th, 2008. Set type, core set. Major strategies, Dark, Gemini, Gladiator Beast. Impact, the beginning of the second Tier 0 format. Phantom Darkness was undoubtedly the most impactful set to the game released within the GX era, on par with Cybernetic Revolution. And it was because with its release came a monster so unbelievably powerful that it would warp the metagame around it for almost the remainder of the year. The monster in question was Dark Armed Dragon, a boss that could only be special summoned if you had exactly 3 darks in grave and could banish a dark from grave to pop a card on field as many times as it wanted in a turn. Just as a reminder, at this point in time priority was still in effect, meaning that the moment Dark Armed came down, it was popping something, even if the opponent had a removal option. This card released alongside a series of cards specifically designed to promote a dark monster strategy with graveyard dumping tools and swarming, such as Armageddon Knight, who dumped the dark from deck on summon, Dark Horus, Creator, and Nephthys, who all had similar summoning conditions to Dark Armed Dragon, just a little less effective presence or too high investment summon, and Dark Grepher and Allure of Darkness, which were both brand new TCG exclusives on release, providing additional grave filling and card draw to the deck that benefited the strategy greatly. Dark Armed Dragon decks, or DAD decks for short, would rapidly take over the meta following this release, which we'll see with the next SJC. While DAD did take the spotlight here almost immediately, there were still other releases in the set worth talking about as it applied to the game as a whole. Yubel was a new series of monsters and the cover monster of the set, able to cycle up their bosses if a previous version is destroyed by a card effect, with all unable to be destroyed by battle, all destroying anything that attacked them, burning the opponent for the monster's attack, Terror Incarnate destroying all monsters on the field except itself at the end phase of your turn, and Ultimate Nightmare able to apply the destroy and burn effects even if it's the one that's doing the attacking. Yubel and her brood would see absolutely no play at this point in time, but a notable point for them was also that Yubel's floating condition could be triggered by popping her while she's still in the hand, which would be notable if a card ever could do that specifically. Cyber Valley was a new monster that could banish itself in various situations to net the controller draws or recursion, able to banish itself when attacked to draw 1 and end the battle phase, banish itself and another monster on your field to draw 2, or banish itself and a card from your hand to stack a card in grave on top of the deck. Out of all of these effects, one probably stood out the moment I mentioned it, and yes, that's why it was played. Cyber Valley not only stalled an entire battle phase on its own, warranting a monster removal prior to the battle phase, but also replaced itself with a card draw, similarly to how Card Trooper did before. Gemini received a few new pieces here with Gemini Lancer, Future Samurai, and the one worth mentioning, Gigaplant, with an effect similar to Illbloods, letting you revive plants and insects from the grave, which was particularly useful for Gemini strategies as that meant you could revive Blazewing Butterfly or the new TCG exclusive Lonefire Blossom, who could tribute off a plant once per turn, including itself, to summon any plant from deck, which could be another Gigaplant. Gladiator Beast would receive a couple of new pieces in Darius, who revives a Gladiator Beast in grave on his tagout summon, and Proving Grounds, a search spell for Gladiator Beast monsters, which would give the deck a little more power, enabling easier access to Heraklinos. Super Ancient Deep Sea King Sekilicanth would see some experimentation at the time with various fish strategies, but see no success in the short term. However, it would become relevant fairly soon after this with an FTK deck in the near future. Super Polymerization let you fusion summon using monsters from either field without the opponent getting to respond, being referred to as Spell Speed 4 in the community, which at this point was way ahead of its time. Fusion materials at this stage were still mostly rigid with very few generic fusions in the current pool, so it wouldn't see play at this time, but would rise in popularity as more and more generic fusions became available. Lastly, Zombie would see a significant release here with Goblin Zombie, an OCG import card that had actually been in the OCG for 5 years prior to this release, being a promo from a Reshef of Destruction game guide in 2003. Goblin Zombie milled the opponent for 1 when it dealt battle damage, and searched a zombie from deck with 1200 or less defense when sent to grave, being mandatory and couldn't miss timing, being among some of the only searchers of its kind, alongside Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest. SJC Houston would be the first testing grounds of this release, taking place 10 days later on February 23rd, and the new dominant threat of DAD was apparent. 9 of the top 16 went to the newly created DAD return strategies, which aimed to abuse DAD's banish pop effect with return from the different dimension, escape from the dark dimension, and dimension fusion to quickly swarm and control a board to end the game. In addition to dad return strategies, Explosion OTK would see a significant boost in popularity here thanks to Cyber Valley, who provided either stalling with his battle phase ending effect or draw power with his banishing effect, making the spell grinding that much more effective. However, neither one of these strategies would take the event. Jonathan Moore, or more commonly known as House of Champs to the community, would win the event with 6 Samurai, being a surprising run for the deck to have in the newly oppressive metagame. This would be followed by a ban list update on March 1st, aimed at balancing the meta from the previous few months, but seeing as how Phantom Darkness had just released, it most likely wouldn't be hitting dad at all. Newly banned were Breaker the Magical Warrior and Magician of Faith, who seemed to be consistently moving on and off the ban list, and Call the Haunted, aimed specifically at the zombie decks of late 2007 abusing it with Card of Safe Return. Newly limited were Ryza as a hit to Monarch strategies, Advanced Ritual Art as a hit to the Demise OTK, Monster Reborn, returning from 0, Nobleman of Crossout, down from 2 as a generic staple hit, and Ojama Trio as a nerf to Baboon Burn strategies. Newly semi'd were Cyber Dragon as a machine and a generic nerf, Light and Darkness Dragon as a nerf to Perfect Circle, Necroface in response to a potential mill deck with the new Phantom Darkness cards, Foolish Burial as it was synergistic with the new Dark cards, and Book of Moon, Mage Power, and Magical Stone Excavation, all up from 1. Lastly, released from the list here were Apprentice Magician, Green, Yellow, and Red gadgets, Jinzo, Creature Swap, Pot of Avarice, and Reckless Greed, all up from 2. SJC Costa Mesa would follow directly after this list a week later on March 8th, and with it, we'd see the absolute dominance of dad return on the meta now that its primary competition of Perfect Circle had been nerfed so significantly. 21 of the top 32 at this event were dad return, cementing it as an absolute menace on the format with no other deck even coming close to dethroning it, with Lazaro Bolido taking the event with it, claiming the first copy of the new SJC prize card Doom Caliber Knight along with it, which itself was a powerful threat in a deck like dad return. There was also a new Duelist Pack Collection Tin released between Costa Mesa and Columbus, but the only card of note it brought was Card Ejector, which was so significantly too slow for the meta that it was almost instantly forgotten. SJC Columbus took place just 3 weeks after Costa Mesa on March 29th, and we'd see similar results with dad return taking 13 of the top 16 for this event. There was a single new deck that did pop up from this event, being Spell Economics FTK, which aimed to use Spell Economics in combination with Dark Magician of Chaos to cycle Dimension Fusion indefinitely, powering some tribute to burn monsters to clean up the game like Toon Cannon Soldier or Shadow Priestess of Ohm, who would tribute DMOC constantly to put it back out of play, revive it with Dimension Fusion, return Fusion to hand, and repeat. Jerry Wang would win the event with dad return, incorporating the Cyber Valley engine into the deck with machine duplication to provide significant drawing power. If it seemed like dad decks were already overpowered in the meta, it was about to get significantly worse, as the next structure deck released 3 days later would spike its power up yet again. The Dark Emperor. Release date April 2nd, 2008. Set type, Structure Deck. Major strategies, Macro. Impact, the rich get richer. The Dark Emperor Structure Deck was the 12th TCG Structure Deck, and it seemed to be learning from all of the mistakes of the previous Structure Decks by releasing some of the highest concentrations of both good new cards for use in the meta, as well as reprints for big cards of the time. In terms of new cards, Caius the Shadow Monarch would give Ryza some actual competition for the title of Best Monarch, banishing 1 card on field on Tribute Summon, then burning the opponent for 1,000 if you banished a Dark Monster. Matching the new Macro End boss, the deck also brought Dimensional Alchemist, which banished the top card of your deck once per turn to gain 500 attack that turn, returning a banished monster to hand when destroyed, and DDR, Different Dimension Reincarnation, which acted like premature burial for banished monsters, taking a discard instead of life points. These 3 cards would all see usage following this release, with DDR finding its way into dad return decks immediately, while Caius and Alchemist would take a little time to find their place in the metagame. Although once it was figured out, Caius would move from here to be one of the most important staple pieces of the metagame. As for reprints, this set pulled no punches, reprinting Kaiku, Bazoo, Exiled Force, Banisher of the Radiance, DD Warrior, Warrior Lady, Scout Plane, Survivor, Master, and Assailant, MST, Knock, Soul Release, Rhoda, Econ, Vortex, Braincon, D-Fissure, Return, Torrential, Bottomless, Karma Cut, and Macro. making this one of the most concentrated bursts of good reprints ever up until this point. And the reprint train wouldn't stop here, as on the same day, the first in a popular long line of reprint sets would also be released, showcasing some of Yu-Gi-Oh's best and worst reprint practices in one place. Gold Series. Release date, April 2nd, 2008. Set type, reprint set. Major strategies, staples of the meta for the last few years. Impact, tendencies on full display. The first ever Gold Series was released in April of 2008, and with it would come a staple of Yu-Gi-Oh! For the foreseeable future, regular reprint sets. After a meta card has been available for usually around a year, it will be made available for reprint sometime in the near future alongside other meta viable cards in a condensed reprint set, which can include reprints of cards from many years prior if they've popped up in meta viability recently. Gold Series was the first set to truly do this to the extent we know today, bringing reprints of popular meta cards like Jinzo, Don Zalug, Breaker the Magical Warrior, DD Warrior Lady, D-Mok, Cyber Dragon, Silva and Gold, Doomdozer, Grandmaster of the Six Samurai, Chimeratech Overdragon, Heavy Storm, Rhoda, BrainCon, Mirror Force, Torrential, Rivalry of Warlords, Skill Train, and probably the most substantial reprint of all, Crush Card Virus, being its first reprint since its stint as the SJC prize card of early 2007. However, there's a catch with this particular reprint, being the first real instance of short printing in Yu-Gi-Oh! Crush Card Virus was so heavily short printed in this run of Gold Series that it was rumored to only be in 1 out of every 5 cases of Gold Series, which was unquestionably one of, if not the absolute worst, cases of short printing in the entire history of the game. This was not made clear prior to the set's release, and almost overnight the card once again shot up into the hundreds for a single copy, which was made even worse by the fact that the undeniably best deck in the format played the card as a staple piece of the deck. SJC Minneapolis would be held a little over a week later on April 12th, and once again, Dad Returned would be the most dominant in the tournament, with many builds now opting for the newly released DDR as an extension piece. We would also see the return of zombies in the meta with a 4th place finish, using Solemn Judgment at its full 3 copies as a way to count out the dads in the format, as negating the summon would prevent a priority pop and put their dark count in grave at 4. This wasn't the only deck to make a surprise appearance, with first place going to Paul Leviton on Gladiator Beast, giving him his second SJC win, similarly playing Triple Judgment in addition to Triple Shadow Imprisoning Mirror in the main deck to counter out Dad. Even with other decks finally finding a footing into the meta, it was clear that Dad Return was far overtuned, and on May 9th, an emergency ban list would go into effect to attempt to quell the menace. Dimension Fusion was banned, Return from the Different Dimension was limited, and Allure of Darkness was semi-limited here. All hits concentrated on bringing Dad's presence in the meta back down by a substantial amount. And there was no clear picture of the results from this than SJC Nashville the next day on May 10th, where Dad Returned would claim a staggering 14 spots in the top 16, showing that the nerfs were effectively useless to the deck's performance, taking all 8 spots in the top 8. The 2 Monarch strategies are worth noting here, however, as both had swapped to using Caius as their primary Monarch of choice, with Gravekeeper Monarch being exceptionally interesting as its field spell Necro Valley prevented a good portion of what Dad decks aimed to accomplish. Jason Holloway would win the day on Dad Return, showcasing how the deck had adapted to the ban list, adding in copies of Escape from the Dark Dimension to offset the lack of fusion and returns, in addition to pivoting to a more Perfect Circle core, to offset the losses in the Dad core. Relief would soon arrive for the format from this period, as the next set would aim to balance out the overwhelming presence of dark decks in the format with the introduction of a few light ones to counter them out. Light of Destruction. Release date, May 13th, 2008. Set type, Core Set. Major strategies, Lightsworn, Arcana Force, Battery Man. Impact, balancing out the format. Light of Destruction was the second core set of 2008, and it would bring waves of new archetypes and support for older ones that would effectively balance out the Dad Return meta landscape, with most support waves being focused on light monsters, similarly to how Phantom Darkness focused on darks, with even a couple of generic light pieces like Guardian of Order, a TCG exclusive that could special summon itself if you controlled 2 or more light monsters, and Honest, who could be discarded from your hand during the damage step to have your monster gain the attack of the monster it was battling, giving all light decks a generic battle trick that would win you any combat. Its headliner archetype was Lightsworn, a series of light monsters that had powerful effects on the condition of sending cards from the top of the deck to the graveyard at some point, usually at the end of the turn, an effect which we will be referring to as its community term of milling from now on. These members included Jane, who boosted to 2100 when attacking and milled 2 in the end phase, Lila, who could move itself to defense mode to pop a spell or trap and milled 3 in the end phase, Garoth, who milled 2 anytime a Lightsworn monster milled, drawing 1 for each Lightsworn monster milled by this effect, Lumina, who could discard a card to revive a Lightsworn monster, milling 3 in the end phase, Raikou, who popped a card on flip effect, milling 3 when it did, Wolf, who special summoned itself if milled, unable to be summoned normally, Celestia, who milled 4 on tribute summon to destroy 2 cards the opponent controlled, Gragonith, who gained 300 attack and defense for every different Lightsworn name in the grave and dealt piercing damage, milling 3 in the end phase, and the payoff card for the entire archetype, Judgment Dragon, who could be special summoned from the hand if you had at least 4 differently named Lightsworn monsters in grave, could pay 1000 life points to nuke the board, and milled 4 in the end phase. Judgment Dragon itself was such a powerhouse thanks to the priority rule, able to hit the board and nuke it before the opponent got a chance to respond, and fulfilling its summoning condition was extremely simple thanks to the milling effect of all the Lightsworn cards. In addition to this baseline, they also received Solar Recharge, which sent a Lightsworn from hand to grave to draw 2 and mill 2, and the TCG exclusive monsters Arcus, who gave your Lightsworns targeting protection and milled 2 in the end phase, and Erin, who shuffled any defense monster she attacked into the deck and milled 3 in the end phase. Lightsworn would move from here to be a major player in the space mostly thanks to the raw power of Judgment Dragon, but would suffer many of the same weaknesses as Dad Return due to their bosses having similar summoning mechanics, causing it to occasionally get caught in the crossfire. Arcana Force would be the other new archetype introduced here, being a series of monsters whose effects are either beneficial or detrimental to the user based on the results of a coin flip on summon, with practically all of them being subpar for the current metagame, although Zero the Fool would see some play purely due to it being a settable wall similar to Marshmallow, who was limited at the time. Battery Man would receive a significant wave of support here for an archetype that saw very little put into it to begin with, giving them Charger, who summoned a Battery Man from deck on Tribute Summon, Microcell, who special summoned a lower level Battery Man from deck on flip, then drew a card when destroyed after, and Industrial Strength, who could special summon itself by banishing 2 Battery Men in grave and could banish a Thunder in grave to pop a monster and spell or trap on field. The support would put some eyes on Battery Man as a strategy, but there were still too few power cards to make the deck work at the time. On the other side of the pond, you had Frogs, who received 2 new support pieces in Unifrog, who could attack directly and, if you controlled another frog when you did, destroy a spell or trap on field, and Substitoad, who could tribute a monster on field to summon a frog from the deck. Substitoad was seen as incredibly useful out the gate thanks to its ability to turbo out a Treeborn frog from the deck, but it failed to make a splash in the meta at the time due to the lack of a proper payoff for loading the grave with frogs at the time, outside of Monarch-related strategies, which were already weaker in the current state of the game. Genzo Returner was an interesting piece of support aimed at retraining the previous Genzo number 7 into a monster that properly supported the titular monster who didn't exist at number 7's release, able to attack directly and summon Genzo from the grave when it was sent to grave, destroying the summoned Genzo at the end phase, but was primarily intended to help summon Genzo Lord, who could only be special summoned by tributing a Genzo on field, had the same trap negate effect, and could destroy all face-up traps to burn the opponent for each. While Lord saw effectively no play, Returner would find an interesting home in the coming months that we'll talk about soon. Volcanic Queen was a weaker version of Lava Golem in many ways, only taking 1 tribute to summon and giving the choice of either a tribute or a burn, but it also allowed the opponent to burn back with its effect, making it noteworthy but not too useful for the time. Golden Ladybug could be revealed in hand every turn to gain 500 life points, which would be seen from time to time in stall strategy side decks, specifically those centered around Final Countdown in later years thanks to its ability to win in time. Phantom Dragon was seen as a sort of counter to the special summon heavy decks, allowing you to summon it on the opponent's turn at the cost of 2 of your own monster card zones in addition to the one it copied, seeing occasional side deck play. Golden Bamboo Sword was an interesting payoff to the previously released Broken Bamboo Sword, letting the controller draw 2, which would see experimentation in FTK decks. Limit Reverse was effectively called the Haunted for weaker monsters, seeing experimentation in some strategies. Summon Limit was a continuous trap that limited both players to a total of 2 summons in a turn. which would see heavy amounts of side deck play over the years. Fossil Dyna Pachycephalo was an OCG import that, when flipped, destroyed all special summon monsters on the field and prevented special summoning while on the field, being incredibly powerful for stun strategies. Lastly, and without question most importantly, Gladiator Beast Gyzarus was a contact fusion of Bestiari and any other Gladiator Beast monster, popped 2 cards when summoned, and could tag out for 2 Gladiator Beasts instead of just 1. This singular card would completely shift the entire fundamental core of Gladiator Beasts as a whole, as now any 2 Gladiator Beasts could make Gyzarus through a combination of tagging out and chaining effects, which would greatly swing a game into your favor. With this release, Gladiator Beasts would see a significant shift in their meta presence over the coming months and moving into the national season, starting with SJC St. Louis on May 24th, where Gladiator Beast would take 6 of the top 16 spots, finally pushing Dad Return off the pedestal it had held since Phantom Darkness. This primary shift, as we can see in Stephen Harris's first place list from this event, was the inclusion of elemental hero Prisma, who had an extremely unique feature for Gladiator Beast decks by being able to reveal Gyzarus in the extra deck to mill a Bestiari from deck and copy its name, allowing Prisma to be contact fused with any other Gladiator Beast into Gyzarus, or to use Test Tiger on it, tagging it out for Darius, who could then revive the Bestiari milled to contact fuse that way. This particular interaction became so integral to the core of Gladiator Beast over the coming months as the deck would rapidly rise into the top deck of the format, making this period known in the community as Gladiator format due to the deck's absolute dominance. As for other newer faces in the format, Machine OTK received an interesting facelift by integrating the Phantom Darkness Dark support pieces with Jinzo and Returner, who could be dumped from the deck to revive a Jinzo sitting in grave, allowing the user to stun any form of responses the opponent might have to a sudden Dark Arm Dragon push. While this deck was Machine OTK, it effectively mixed the Dad package into the previous Machine package, making it a new beast entirely. Ocean Control, though it had popped up a few times prior to this, would make another appearance here, being primarily focused around looping various hero monsters using Hero City and Ocean, with plenty of text from the meta sprinkled in like Shadow Imprisoning Mirror and Solemn Judgment. Lightsworn would see its first top here, interestingly including 3 Card of Safe Return, which could trigger off your Wolf and Luminous summons as an easy way to draw for Judgment Dragon. It also included Necrogardna, who was a great mill off the Lightsworn effects and could double as a Crush Card Virus target. Lastly, Counter Fairy made another appearance here, taking advantage of the various counter traps legal at the time like Dark Bribe, Divine Wrath, Magic Drain, and Solemn Judgment, alongside Bountiful Artemis and Harvest Angel of Wisdom to benefit from them or loop them, providing powerful control. US Nationals would follow a month later on June 21st, and we'd see similar results to St. Louis, with Gladiator Beast being the deck to beat in the format. However, a large deviation from the usual Dad Return structure was made here in the creation of Dad Turbo, a deck entirely focused on turboing through your deck as fast as possible to generate advantage and to summon out Dad to end the game, foregoing the usual return inclusion for more draw power. This was primarily thanks to the Destiny Hero package that had already been staple in Dad Return up until this point, with one deck list here going so far as to include Limit Reverse as a way to continuously summon back Disc Commander for his Draw 2 effect. Chris Bowling would win the event with Gladiator Beast, seeing very little change in the deck structure since St. Louis. The European Championships were held the same day, and similarly, the top 8 breakdown showed a serious favor for both Gladiator Beast and Dad decks, both Return and Turbo variants. Vasilis Bulbasakos would win the event with Gladiator Beast 2, with a couple of extremely noteworthy additions to his list. The first was Soul Taker, which was an additional piece of monster removal to get the ball rolling and to force targets like Cyber Valley to be unable to resolve their effects. The second, and far more impactful for the long term of the game, was the inclusion of Raikou. Gladiator Beast specifically at this stage had a bit of a mind game going with this angle, as most players would assume Gladiator Beast leaving a set monster on the board would be Haplomus, who you wouldn't want to attack and give the opponent a free tag out. By including Raikou here, Vasilis could usually get it to the next turn, where they could flip it and choose their target then, breaking a more established board rather than taking the pickings when attacked into. This inclusion of Raikou would slowly become more and more staple in the format as a generic removal tool that just happened to also mill you, proving to be a great asset for many decks. Canadian Nationals would follow a week later on June 28th, and we'd once again see Gladiator Beast as a top threat, with Lazaro Bolito taking first place for the second time this year, this time on Gladiator Beast, who opted to tech one Wabuku to guarantee combat survival for his beasts. Last for this block, SJC Philly would take place a week later on July 5th, and we'd once again see similar results from Gladiator Beast, but with a little more variety outside of their chunk of the top cut. For starters, Soul Control had picked up significant popularity here, using Royal Oppression to counter out the Gladiator beast summons and Prime Material Dragon as a way to counter out Gyzaris, still using Monarch powerhouses like Caius, Ryza, and Thessalos to boot. The other was the first meta appearance of Lightsworn Monarch, seeing a single top spot, mixing the engine of Soul Control with Lightsworn to enable powerful tribute plays while setting up Judgment Dragon or Celestia pushes. Michael Kohanim would win the event with Gladiator Beast, being the 5th event in a row won by the new meta powerhouse, seeing little to no difference in his variant from the other winning lists. The national season would end with this event, followed by a pack that many were not necessarily the most excited for, but was definitely a welcome inclusion for a couple of specific reprints. Retro Pack. Release date, July 8th, 2008. Set type, reprint set. Major strategies, DM era staples. Impact, seemingly out of nowhere reprints. So Retro Pack was an extremely weird pack, even in its own time. This pack, being the first ever European exclusive pack, was intended to bring a few cards that had only been released as promos in the US to the European market for the first time, like Blastsphere, Copycat, and Relieve Monster, all of which were Shonen Jump promos in the US but never released in the EU. It also brought reprints of many DM era staples like Regeki, Graceful Charity, and Painful Choice, but the issue lies in the fact that many of these cards had already been banned for some time at this point, making their reprints questionable. SJC Honolulu would take place just 4 days later on July 12th, and, surprise surprise, the meta hadn't really shifted from the national season, seeing a slight shift in the popularity of Soul Control and the inclusion of Fossil Dyna into some lists, but aside from that, very minor. Mario Matthew would take the event with Gladiator Beast, playing 3 copies of Anti-Spell Fragrance as a way to stun dad decks for a turn while he set up Gyzaris lines. SJC Toronto took place 2 weeks later on July 26th, and this would be without question one of the best events for Gladiator Beast, seeing them take a whopping 12 of the top 16, seeing Lazaro Bolito take his 3rd major event victory of the year with Gladiator Beast once again, being a similar list to his previous Canadian Nationals win. The only other thing to talk about with this particular event was the single top from a fairly new deck in Phantom Turbo, which aimed to load the grave with powerful Dark Monster bosses, then copy their effects with Phantom of Chaos, including cards like Destiny Hero Plasma, Dark Arm Dragon, and the Dark Creator. Although the meta had effectively sat still for the past few months, changes were coming, and whether they could be considered good or bad would entirely depend on who you asked. Premium Pack 2. Release date, July 31st, 2008. Set type, OCG Import Set. Major strategies, Elemental Hero, Zombies, Fairy. Impact, mostly bulk, 1 sleeper powerhouse. Premium Pack 2, similar to the first, was an OCG import set almost entirely focused on bringing over the OCG imports we had not yet received, with a focus placed on the pieces from the GX manga. For those who are unaware, the GX manga is actually extremely different from the anime following the same characters, as rather than being a rotating threat each season, it's entirely focused on a single central antagonist searching for the Planet series monsters. Many of the rather odd legacy support pieces you probably know from the TCG, alongside some other out-of-place bosses, came from this side series, which I'll have to cover another day as it's extremely interesting, but for now we did receive a few new cards. For Elemental Heroes, we received Woodsman, Nosp, Heat, Lady Heat, Terra Firma, Inferno, and Voltic, all of which are used by Jaden in the manga, and all of which saw little to no success on release, with the only one seeing experimentation being Voltic as a way to recur your pieces banished for Miracle Fusion in later formats. Fairy strategies would receive Mackenzie's cards Athena, who burn the opponent anytime a fairy is summoned, and could cycle a fairy on field for a fairy in grave once per turn, Hecatrice, who searched for Valhalla, and Valhalla the Hall of the Fallen, which let you special summon a fairy monster from hand if you controlled no monsters. Athena was left behind the moment she was released, not being worth experimenting with as she was slow in the current format, although Hecatrice and Valhalla would be experimented with in the current counter fairy strategies. We would also receive the boss of Konihata Snake deck in Evil Dragon Inanta, who could be summoned by banishing all reptiles in grave, gain 600 attack and defense for each, and destroyed a card on field at the end of every turn. Last, and most importantly, we'd receive Bastion's Mizuki, a zombie that could banish itself from grave to revive another zombie. This card would become integral to later zombie strategies not only as a body, but as an additional piece of extension for the strategy to continue reviving monsters even after most of your revival spells were used up. This, however, was just the warm-up set release, as under a week later, the year's starter deck would release, and it would break the useless starter deck streak of the previous years by providing a completely new concept to the game that would change how we played Yu-Gi-Oh! Forever. Starter Deck 5Ds. Release date August 5th, 2008. Set type Starter Deck. Major strategies Synchron. Impact the soft launch of a new era. The 5D Starter Deck is considered to be the official start of the 5Ds era of Yu-Gi-Oh! And with it came the first new extra deck mechanic ever to the game, Synchros. On paper, Synchros seem to be effectively a mesh of fusions and rituals, being housed in the extra deck like fusions but taking generic materials like rituals, requiring sending monsters from the field to grave whose total levels equal the new Synchro monster you were wanting to summon, requiring one of those to be the newly designated tuner monsters, which were enablers for Synchro summoning. In this initial wave, we received the first tuner monsters, Toon Warrior, Water Spirit, Magna Drago, Frequency Magician, and most importantly, Junk Synchron, who's by far the best of this initial batch thanks to being an instant level 5 Synchro by itself, and the first Synchro monsters, Junk Warrior, Gaia Knight the Force of Earth, and Colossal Fighter. Of these initial monsters, the only one that would be considered a newly coined extra deck staple from this batch was Colossal Fighter, whose Warrior Revive on Destruction effect did not exclude himself, meaning that if it was destroyed in battle, it could revive itself infinitely. In addition to this introduction, reprints here would include Mystic Tomato, Exiled Force, Smashing Ground, and Lightning Vortex, which while most had been effectively phased out due to power creep, were still extremely useful reprints to have. The World Championships would take place 4 days later on August 9th in Berlin, Germany, and it would be a send-off for the GX era in its own way, being one of the last tournaments without Synchros present in extra decks, as that major push wouldn't happen for another month. As expected from the previous results, Gladiator Beast would take the majority of the top cut, also taking the World Championship title piloted by Musoka Kazuki of Japan. One of the surprise performances though came from Dimensional Skill Drain Beat, or as it would be colloquially referred to as Macro Drain, being a collection of powerful beaters under Skill Drain paired with Burden of the Mighty, which was a video game promo card from the same set as Dimensional Prison that lowered opponents' monsters' attack by 100 for each of their levels, making it easier to win Skill Drain beatdown trades. SJC Indianapolis would also take place just 1 week later after Worlds, on August 16th, and similarly, Gladiator Beast would once again dominate the tournament, winning the event piloted by Robert Ackerman as a last hurrah for the deck before the 5Ds era began in full. Aside from the usual suspects, we would also see one more unique deck top the event, being Hero Beat, building on the success of Macro Drain from the World Championship to use a similar strategy with the high attack values of heroes of Neos Alias and Captain Gold under Skill Drain to take combats effectively. Lastly, before the new era begins, a ban list would be released on September 1st to attempt to bring order to the otherwise Gladiator Beast dominated environment. Newly banned were Demok, a hit to Dad Return being one of the key pieces of the deck, Disc Commander, targeted at a recent surge in popularity alongside Limit Reverse, and Premature Burial, a generic staple that had been a long time coming in many ways, though was curiously not banned with Monster Reborn, which remained legal. Newly limited were Breaker the Magic Warrior, because Konami could not make up their minds about this card for some unearthly reason. Cyber Dragon, down from 2, being a hit to both Machine and the generic staple pool, Dandelion, a preemptive hit to an upcoming Shonen Jump promo, Gorz the Emissary of Darkness, a preemptive hit to an upcoming card from the set Dark Legends, and Monster Gate and Reasoning, hits to various FTKs in the format. Semi-limited were Dark Arm Dragon for obvious reasons, Judgment Dragon to hamper Lightsworn slightly, Phantom of Chaos to prevent getting dad copies, Rescue Cat as a preemptive hit to an upcoming change in Gladiator Beast, Card of Safe Return as it had become a powerful draw tool in many strategies at this point, Chain Strike up from 1 as a boost to Chain Burn, and Nobleman of Crossout up from 1 as a generic boost. Lastly, unlimited were Malicious, Light and Darkness Dragon, Allure of Darkness, Mage Power, Rhoda, and Royal Decree, some of which were in hindsight the worst choices they could have made here. With these changes in place, the 5Ds era would fully take effect with the release of the next core set the following day, and while many things would change in the upcoming meta, so much would stay the same from the previous, as well as get significantly worse in ways no one would have expected. A huge shout out to my Dark Law level patrons, Jukes, Otaku GamerX, Prinrin, and Ryza339, as well as all of my other patrons over on patreon.com. If you want to help support the channel and see my videos a day early, consider supporting me on Patreon, where support tiers start at just $1 a month. If you enjoyed what you saw here today, consider subscribing to the channel. We're actually getting really close to 20,000 subscribers, so any little bit helps. So be sure to pound that subscribe button. Thank you all again, and I'll see you next time.